Hey guys, tonight we're going to step quietly into one of the most shadowy roles in human history, the life of the eunuch. For centuries, across kingdoms and empires, these figures lived in silence, standing just behind the throne, guarding secrets and carrying lives shaped by sacrifice. They were there in the courts of Rome, in the vast palaces of China, and in the great halls of the Ottoman sultans, always present, always near power, but never truly free. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you haven't already. It really helps the channel grow, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how many of us are sharing this moment together from different corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, settle in, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and allow yourself to sink slowly into tonight's story. This won't be a tale of action or heroes, but of quiet routines, long corridors, and the strange silent existence of those who lived close to power yet belonged to no one. Tonight we begin at the very beginning, with the distant origins of eunuchs, and how their shadowed presence first appeared in human history. Long before the modern age, long before nations were drawn onto maps in the way we know them today, there were courts and palaces where power gathered itself in silence. Across empires that rose and fell, there existed a particular figure, the eunuch, whose very identity was shaped by a transformation, both physical and symbolic. To understand their lives, one must begin far in the distant past, in the earliest civilizations where rulers sought loyalty so complete that it required the removal of ordinary human ties. The first references to eunuchs appear in records from ancient Mesopotamia, where kings and nobles employed castrated servants within their households. By eliminating the possibility of family, heirs, or divided loyalty, rulers believed they could secure attendants whose devotion would remain fixed entirely on the throne. In the Assyrian and Babylonian empires, eunuchs were not only guardians of the royal chambers, but sometimes trusted generals and administrators. Their condition, at once a mark of limitation and of chosen purpose, made them useful in a way ordinary men could never be. From the Mesopotamian plains, the practice moved eastward, finding its most elaborate form in China. By the Zhou dynasty, as early as the 8th century BCE, castrated servants were already being recorded in palace registers. Over the centuries, their presence grew, until by the Ming dynasty in the 14th to 17th centuries CE, tens of thousands of eunuchs served within the Forbidden City. In China, eunuchs became more than mere servants. They became the mediators of imperial will, controlling access to the emperor and shaping decisions that touched millions. Some rose to extraordinary heights of influence, like Shang He, the great Ming admiral, who commanded vast naval expeditions across the Indian Ocean. His journeys reaching as far as Africa were not only voyages of trade, but demonstrations of Chinese power, all under the command of a eunuch. In Byzantium, the continuation of the Roman Empire in the East, eunuchs occupied a similarly paradoxical role. Within the empire's elaborate bureaucracy, eunuchs became indispensable. Roman law had long recognized castration, though it was sometimes officially frowned upon, yet emperors and patriarchs alike turned to eunuchs to fill positions of trust. Their inability to produce heirs was considered a safeguard. They could not found dynasties of their own, and so they posed less of a threat to imperial succession. Yet this very restriction allowed them to move freely within the world of women and rulers, occupying spaces no other men could enter without suspicion. In the sacred halls of Hagia Sophia, even within the church itself, eunuchs sometimes held high clerical positions, blending the political and the spiritual in their service. Farther west, in the Islamic empires, eunuchs became an entrenched feature of court life. The Abbasid caliphs of Baghdad employed them as guardians of harems and treasuries. In the Ottoman Empire, which rose after the fall of Byzantium, their presence reached new heights. The Topkapi Palace in Istanbul housed not only sultans but entire households of concubines and wives, and it was eunuchs who guarded these hidden chambers. The chief black eunuch, known as the Kuzlar Arsa, became one of the most powerful officials in the empire, wielding authority not only over the harem, but often in political affairs as well. His influence stretched beyond palace walls. touching matters of diplomacy and administration. The role of eunuchs was always entangled with both privilege and suffering. On the one hand, castration was a violation of the body, a deliberate cutting away of future possibility. On the other hand, for many, especially those taken as slaves or captives, it offered a pathway into the heart of power. In societies where lineage defined a man's status, eunuchs carved out a different kind of existence, one without descendants, but not without meaning. They could rise higher than most freeborn men, even while their lives were circumscribed by a condition few would willingly choose. This paradox helps explain why the role of eunuchs persisted across so many different cultures, over such vast stretches of time, from China to the Middle East, from Byzantium to Ethiopia. Rulers sought out men who, precisely because of their altered state, could serve as both insiders and outsiders. They belonged entirely to the palace, yet had no true family ties beyond it. They could be trusted with the most intimate spaces of power, yet they always remained in some sense apart, their existence marked by separation. It is striking, when viewed from a distance, how different cultures arrived at the same conclusion, that loyalty could be secured through sacrifice of the self. Whether through voluntary choice, forced captivity or punishment, men were remade into servants of the state. In each case, the reasoning was similar: by removing ordinary attachments, wife, children, legacy, a eunuch's world was narrowed, and within that narrowing, rulers found a strange kind of reliability. The eunuch became both tool and symbol, embodying the authority of the ruler who commanded not only lands and armies, but the very lives of those closest to him. The very presence of eunuchs also reflected deeper anxieties within these empires. Rulers, surrounded by rivals, plots and shifting loyalties, feared betrayal from within their own households. Eunuchs, because of their condition, were seen as safe. They could not father sons who might claim succession. They could not stir political factions based on bloodline, and they could be kept in close proximity without the same risks posed by other men. The existence of eunuchs, then, was less about their usefulness as individuals, and more about the insecurity of rulers who demanded absolute control. And so, across time, the eunuch became a recurring figure in human history, slipping in and out of view depending on the empire and the age, but always present somewhere, always carrying the same burden of transformation. Their story is not confined to a single people, or a single dynasty. It is a pattern repeated wherever power drew itself inward, seeking servants who could never become rivals. As the centuries unfolded, their numbers would swell, their influence would grow, and their silent presence would become indispensable to the functioning of some of the greatest empires the world has ever known. But before they could serve in such capacities, there was always another story, the story of the child, before the change, who would one day be taken from the ordinary paths of life, and remade into something else entirely. Or, before the palace walls, before the titles and silent duties, there was always a child, a boy born into a world that did not yet know what would be taken from him. Or, his early years were marked, like those of most children, by moments of simplicity, the rhythm of waking with the light, the laughter of siblings, the warmth of a mother's hand guiding him through the early steps of life. In distant villages and bustling cities alike, eunuchs began as ordinary boys, unaware of the fate that would divide their lives into a before and an after. In some cases, these children were born to families so poor that survival itself was a constant uncertainty. In the markets of ancient China, desperate parents sometimes gave up their sons, believing that palace service, however cruel its path, offered a chance at survival, perhaps even advancement. In the Ottoman world, children captured in wars, or taken through the slave trade, were marked out for the same fate, their destinies rewritten not by choice but by the will of others. And in Byzantium, some were born into servitude, offered to the church or the emperor, in a gesture of loyalty, their futures shaped before they were old enough to understand the meaning of sacrifice. Yet, no matter the empire, the child's early life carried the same fragile moments of humanity. The play of shadows on a wall at dusk, the taste of bread warm from the fire, the sound of elders reciting prayers or telling stories of gods and kings. These details formed the brief span of ordinary life that would soon be erased, leaving only memory to anchor the child in what once was. There was innocence in this stage, a sense of belonging to family and place. In the narrow streets of a Chinese town, a boy might chase after kites lifted by the spring wind, his laughter mingling with the bustle of vendors and travelers. In the crowded quarters of Constantinople, he might hear the bells of churches or the chants of markets echoing against stone walls. Along the banks of the Nile or the Tigris, he might splash in the water with friends, oblivious to the fact that men in distant palaces already viewed children like him as resources, as bodies that could be shaped into instruments of loyalty. The child at this stage could not know that the very qualities that made him ordinary, his youth, his lack of agency, his pliability, were also what marked him out as suitable for the transformation ahead. Eunuchs were not born, but made, and the making always began with the taking of a child from his family, from his games, from the slow unfolding of a life that might have been lived in obscurity, but with a wholeness he would never again know. This looming fate cast a shadow, even if he did not yet see it. In households where poverty pressed heavily, rumors of palace service sometimes reached the ears of parents who saw in them a grim opportunity. In times of conquest, families torn apart by war had little say when soldiers selected captives destined for castration, and in some cases, punishment itself led to the act. Men convicted of crimes were sometimes castrated as retribution, their sons inheriting the stigma of belonging to a family marked by dishonor. Yet for the boy, before the change, there remained moments of not knowing. He might still find comfort in stories told by his grandmother, still run errands with his father to the fields or workshops, still wait to the smell of grain cooking in the early morning. These experiences would later be recalled only dimly, like a fading dream, but they formed the last pieces of an identity tied to kinship, community, and continuity. It is in this stage that the tragedy of the eunuch's life becomes most visible, not in the later years, when power and influence sometimes softened the memory of loss, but in the moment of contrast between what could have been and what was to come. For every child who became a eunuch, there was a path denied, a family that would never exist, children who would never be born, a lineage that would end before it began. In China, records show that some boys were castrated as young as 8 or 9, brought into the palace at an age when play should still have defined their world. The youngest were often chosen because they could be molded entirely within the palace system, growing up knowing no other life. In the Ottoman Empire, many of the boys brought into service through slavery were in their early teens, strong enough to endure the physical ordeal, but still malleable enough to accept the discipline of palace training. In Byzantium, castration sometimes occurred later, when young men were selected for specific positions, but the break with their earlier lives was just as stark. Behind these practices lay the unspoken assumption that the child's innocence, his vulnerability, was what made him valuable. A boy without attachments could become a man whose only loyalty was to the throne. A boy whose future had been cut away could be entrusted with the futures of emperors and sultans. And so, in the quiet of villages and the noise of cities, children were marked by a fate that remained invisible to them until the moment it arrived. For the child himself, there was no sense of destiny, no grand design, only the ordinariness of early life, lived one day at a time, unaware that each day brought him closer to the moment of transformation. The laughter with friends, the warmth of a family meal, the rhythm of work and rest, all these would soon be interrupted, and in their place would come silence, discipline, and a life lived not for the self but for others. And yet, even as the child played in the dust, or listened to the hum of evening voices in his household, the palace loomed far away, waiting. The child's story would not remain his own for long. It would be claimed by rulers who saw in his body not a life to be lived but a service to be rendered. The moment of change approached, even if he could not yet imagine it. The transition from innocence to transformation is one of the most haunting aspects of eunuch history. It is not simply the act of castration that defined them, but the abrupt severing of childhood itself. They were children first, full of possibility, embedded in families, linked to the simple joys of early life, but they were destined to become something else, to step away from the path most children walked, and into a new existence where nothing would ever be the same. And so, the child who once played freely, who once belonged to family and kin, would soon find himself led into a room where voices hushed, where tools were prepared, where his past would be cut away. This is where innocence ended, and the long silence began. There came a moment when the child, no longer innocent but not yet grown, was led into a room where the air itself seemed heavier than before. It was the threshold that divided his old life from the new, a moment spoken of in whispers, never fully explained to those who would undergo it. This was the ritual of transformation, when an ordinary boy would be remade into something else, into one who belonged no longer to himself but to the will of rulers and the machinery of empire. The act of castration, though clinical in its finality, carried layers of meaning that extended far beyond the body. In ancient China, where the practice reached its fullest scale, the process was sometimes performed by specialists whose grim trade ensured the supply of servants to the forbidden city. A sharp knife, a basin, cloths to staunch bleeding, these were the tools by which the future was decided. For some, the entire organ was removed. For others, only the testes. The first method, though harsher, was considered safer by some traditions because infection could more easily be controlled. Either way, the act was irreversible. The line between childhood and service cut as sharply as the blade itself. The surroundings of this moment varied from empire to empire, but the atmosphere was always the same: silence, dread, and the sense that something far greater than the individual was being enacted. In Byzantium, castration was often performed on captives or chosen servants, sometimes within the confines of monasteries or private chambers. In the Ottoman Empire, African boys captured in the slave trade were brought through harsh journeys across deserts before facing the operation, often in conditions that were brutal and unforgiving. In some accounts, survival rates were alarmingly low, yet those who endured became indispensable parts of palace life. The ritual was not only physical but symbolic. By undergoing castration, the boy was cut away from the normal pathways of human existence. No longer would he grow into manhood as others did. No longer would he marry, father children, or leave descendants behind. His life was narrowed, his body altered, his destiny redirected. In the eyes of rulers, this was precisely the point. He was now a figure without divided loyalties, a person with no heirs to scheme for, no lineage to pursue, no household of his own to protect. His loyalty, in theory, belonged entirely to the throne. The silence that followed was perhaps the most haunting part of the ritual. The boy, weak from pain, would often lie for days in recovery, tended by those who had endured the same fate before him. The sound of the outside world continued. Footsteps, voices, the rustle of palace routines. But for the newly made eunuch, there was an inward quiet, a space where the future pressed down like a weight. What had been cut away was not only flesh but possibility itself. Castration also carried a symbolic association with purity, or at least with separation. In many traditions, eunuchs were considered safe to guard the inner chambers of rulers' households, particularly where women lived in seclusion. Their altered state marked them as neither fully men nor entirely outside the category of men, existing in a liminal space that made them suitable for roles denied to others. In China, they were called Taijian, or court officials, though the title masked the brutality of how they came to be. In Byzantium, they could rise to positions of great honor, but always with the understanding that their service was rooted in a body that had been remade. The process itself was deeply dangerous. Infections were common, and many did not survive. In some cultures, elaborate precautions were taken. Herbs, poultices, and ritual cleansing were meant to increase survival chances. In others, survival was left to chance, with the weak perishing and only the strong passing through to the next stage of life. This brutality underscored the expendability of the individual in the eyes of empires. The palace needed eunuchs, but not every boy was expected to live. Those who did, however, carried the mark of endurance, their survival already a sign that they belonged in the world of rulers. And yet, beyond the pain and the silence, the ritual carried a strange sense of rebirth. In some accounts, eunuchs themselves later spoke of this moment as a second birth, one that severed them from the world of kinship and placed them in the world of power. They no longer belonged to their families but to the palace. Their identity, reshaped by the knife, became tied entirely to service. The boy who had once run in the fields or played in the alleys no longer existed. In his place stood a servant of emperors, sultans, and kings. The symbolism of this transformation extended into religion as well. In Christianity, some texts interpreted eunuchs as figures of devotion, citing the passage in the Gospel of Matthew that spoke of those who had made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. In practice, while voluntary castration was rare, the association lingered, giving eunuchs in Byzantium a peculiar position within both church and state. In Islam, the use of eunuchs was justified as a practical necessity for guarding harems, though the practice of castration itself was officially frowned upon. In China, Confucian scholars debated the morality of the practice, yet emperors continued to rely on eunuchs as essential instruments of rule. All of these interpretations pointed to the same reality. The ritual of transformation was not simply a mutilation, but a creation of a new category of person. Eunuchs were set apart, marked by their condition, and made into symbols of loyalty and service. Their lives would now unfold within palace walls, governed by discipline, secrecy, and the ever-present awareness that they had been remade for purposes not their own. The silence after the operation was thus more than recovery. It was the silence of a threshold crossed, a moment when the child's past life faded away, leaving only memory and loss. Ahead lay a new existence, one of routine, obedience, and proximity to power, but also one of loneliness, separation, and the unending reminder of what had been taken. As the eunuch rose from his bed, weak but alive, he stepped into a world that would never again allow him to belong fully to himself. His future would be written in the corridors of palaces, in the shadows of rulers, in the silent duties that defined his kind across centuries. The ritual of transformation was complete, and now began the long service for which he had been remade. And so, with his body altered and his past behind him, he was led toward the gates of the palace, where the grandeur of a new world awaited. Vast halls, endless corridors, and the routines of service that would define the rest of his life. The first awakening after the ritual of transformation was never sudden. It did not come in the brightness of day, or with the clarity of thought, but in the long drift between fever and shivering cold, between shallow breaths and the dull throb of pain that ran like a heavy current through the body. For the child who had been made a eunuch, consciousness returned in fragments. At first, there was only the weight of exhaustion, a sense of being pulled down into silence, as though the world itself had pressed a hand against his chest to keep him from rising too quickly. The body, fragile and bloodless, lay still on a mat or pallet, watched over by attendants who themselves had once endured the same passage. Around him lingered the thick smell of herbs, or of cloths, damp with water, placed there to stem the heat of fever. Some would hear the slow drip of liquid into bowls, others the soft scraping of footsteps as caretakers moved in and out. But the sounds felt distant, muffled, as though the world had folded itself away. The pain, when it came clearly, was not sharp but constant, an ache that gripped the lower body and radiated outward, leaving no position of comfort. Even lying still brought no relief, only a dull pressure that reminded him of what had been cut away. Moving was worse, and so most lay for days in near silence, their breaths shallow, their eyes half closed against the spinning blur of recovery. The fever itself was a boundary, many never crossed it, slipping into death before their bodies could knit themselves to survival. But those who endured, who lingered through the sweating nights and trembling days, found that their breath grew steadier, their strength returning in the smallest of increments. In those early days, there was little sense of identity. Pain stripped thought to its simplest form, the need to endure until another breath, another moment passed. Yet slowly, in the spaces between discomfort, something else began to take shape. It was the dawning realization that he was no longer who he had been. The child who had played, who had known the warmth of family, who had dreamed, however faintly, of becoming a man like others, that child had been left behind. In his place stood someone altered, someone who had passed through an experience most would never comprehend. This was the first awakening, not only to consciousness after fever, but to the new state of being. The eunuch's life began here, in the recognition of separation. The world outside might continue as before. Families raising sons, men taking wives, lineages stretching into the future, But for him, that path had been closed. He belonged now to a narrow road, one defined not by bloodline or inheritance, but by service, proximity to power, and the strange in-between identity that eunuchs carried across centuries. The body bore the marks of this change. Weakness lingered for weeks, and movements felt uncertain, as though the frame of the child was adjusting itself to a new equilibrium. For those whose entire organ had been removed, urination required adaptation, often through the use of small tubes to prevent closure of the wound. For others, the loss was less visibly severe, but no less life-altering. In either case, the sense of vulnerability was profound, the awareness that the body had been opened and remade, and that the boy had little choice but to live with its consequences. In many traditions, older eunuchs helped the newly made adjust. In China's Forbidden City, where thousands lived within the same system, the younger were tended by those who had survived the ordeal decades earlier, passing down not only care, but also an unspoken understanding of endurance. In the Ottoman palaces, black eunuchs, often from Nubia or Ethiopia, received training and guidance in their first months, learning to accept their condition while being initiated into the routines of palace service. This solidarity was not one of choice, but of necessity. Those who had been made eunuchs shared an experience so singular, so isolating, that only others like them could offer recognition. The psychological awakening was slower, less visible but no less profound. A new identity began to form, not chosen, but imposed. The eunuch was no longer a child of his family, he was a possession of the palace, his existence defined by service. Yet in this severance, there was also a peculiar clarity. He no longer needed to think of heirs or inheritance, of marriage or dowries, of competing obligations between household and state. His path, however narrow, was fixed, and in its clarity lay a strange kind of power. He had been remade into one whose loyalty was undivided, one whose future was bound entirely to rulers. This realization was not immediate. At first there was only the struggle to stand, to walk, to eat, to regain strength without collapsing. But as weeks turned into months, as routines settled into place, the eunuch began to see himself differently. He was neither fully man nor entirely outside the category of men. He occupied a liminal space, one that carried both stigma and utility. Outsiders might mock or fear him, but rulers valued him precisely because of what he was not. This ambiguous identity, formed in the shadow of pain, became the foundation for everything that followed. And so the first awakening was layered, the body's recovery from fever, the mind's dawning recognition of loss, and the spirit's slow adaptation to a role that would shape the rest of life. It was not a joyous awakening, but a sober one, colored by the awareness that the boy's old life was gone, and a new one, stranger, narrower, but deeply bound to power, had begun. In the days after recovery, he would begin to walk the palace corridors, to glimpse the routines of servants, to hear the echoes of rulers' footsteps in grand halls. The pain would dull, though it never disappeared entirely, leaving behind a ghostly reminder of the transformation. But the identity of the eunuch, fragile at first, began to harden. He was now part of a brotherhood defined by absence, a fraternity of the remade, whose lives would forever unfold in service to the world's most powerful figures. And in this new awareness, the silence that had begun with the ritual of transformation deepened. It was a silence not only of body but of life, a quiet acceptance that the path ahead was no longer his own, but one carved for him by empires, rulers, and the inexorable logic of power. When the boy at last recovered enough to be taken from his narrow chamber, he was led through corridors and across courtyards until, for the first time, he stood before the palace gates. This was the true threshold, the visible boundary that separated the common world from the enclosed realm of emperors, sultans, and kings. The gates themselves varied from one empire to another, yet in every tradition they held the same symbolic weight. They were massive, often built of heavy timbers bound in iron, or of stone carved with symbols of divine power. They loomed above the figure of the boy-turned-eunuch, reminding him of how small he was in comparison to the forces that now governed his life. In China, the gates of the Forbidden City stretched red and gold beneath the vastness of the sky, their roofs layered with glazed tiles that glittered in sunlight. Entering them was like stepping into a different world, one ordered by ceremony and hierarchy, where every movement followed centuries of ritual. In Byzantium, the gates of the great palace at Constantinople rose above the hippodrome, decorated with mosaics and guarded by soldiers whose armor reflected the morning sun. For the Ottomans, the Topkapi palace gates opened onto layered courtyards, each one more restricted, more exclusive, until only the innermost chambers lay beyond reach of all but the trusted few. Passing through these gates, the eunuch entered into a realm of grandeur that seemed overwhelming at first sight. Towers rose above him, halls stretched into distances he had never known, and gardens bloomed with plants brought from across the empire. Marble floors, gilded ceilings, silken draperies, the scent of incense and spices, all of it struck the senses like a revelation. It was a beauty designed not only for rulers but for the awe of all who entered, a beauty that declared the supremacy of empire and the majesty of its sovereigns. And yet, amid this splendor, there was also a profound sense of loneliness. The gates had closed behind him, sealing him off from the world outside. No longer was he a son of his family, no longer a child of his village. He had been remade into a creature of the palace, bound by rules and discipline that reached into every detail of life. He owned nothing, not even his own body, which had been altered for the sake of this service. He could not inherit property, could not raise children, could not establish a household. What little he was given, clothing, food, a place to sleep, belonged not to him but to the institution he now served. The grandeur of the palace was thus double-edged. To outsiders, it appeared as a world of luxury, of silks and jewels, of banquets and festivals. But to those within, especially the newly made eunuchs, it was also a world of confinement. Every gate that opened also closed, and every step deeper into the palace meant another step away from freedom. The walls that glittered with decoration were also walls that shut out the common world, holding him in a space where every act was watched, every word restrained, every gesture measured against protocol. For many eunuchs, this first encounter with the palace was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The halls of emperors seemed eternal, filled with a stillness that suggested they had always existed and would always exist. The boy felt himself absorbed into something larger, something that dwarfed individual identity. He was not himself anymore, but a fragment of a system, a moving part in the vast mechanism of power. This was reinforced by the hierarchy he immediately encountered. Eunuchs were divided into ranks, some destined to serve in kitchens or stables, others to guard doors, and a few, those clever, disciplined, or fortunate enough to rise into positions of influence near the ruler himself. At the beginning, however, the boy had no place except at the lowest tier, a servant to servants, watched and trained, reminded constantly that he was nothing without obedience. Loneliness deepened in this environment. He saw the laughter of courtiers, the affection between families of nobles, the ceremonies in which emperors displayed their children as symbols of dynastic continuity. For him, these were visions of a life forever denied. He could guard the doors of harems, but never hold a wife. He could raise the emperor's children in trust, but never know his own. He could carry messages of power across the palace, but never pass down a name of his own blood. The gates, therefore, came to symbolize not just entry but separation. They were the markers of a destiny in which he belonged to the palace, but never fully belonged to the life within it. He was at once inside and outside, close to rulers yet always kept apart from their lineage. In time, this paradox would form the heart of his identity, essential, trusted, sometimes powerful, but always marked by the absence of what others took for granted. In the long days that followed his arrival, the boy learned to navigate this world. He learned the protocols of greeting, the gestures of deference, the rhythms of palace life. He learned how to walk silently in corridors, how to keep his eyes lowered, how to blend into the background while always remaining alert. The grandeur that had first overwhelmed him became familiar, though never ordinary. Every gate, every hall, every chamber held meaning, layers of ritual and symbolism that reminded him, again and again, that he lived in a world apart. And yet, within this world of walls and gates, a strange sense of belonging began to stir. He was surrounded by others like himself, eunuchs, who had endured the same transformation, who carried the same loneliness. Among them he found a mirror of his own condition, and in that reflection, the beginnings of acceptance. He had entered the palace gates, not as a child of family, but as a servant of empire, and this identity, however narrow, was now his own. The grandeur and the loneliness were inseparable. To live within the palace was to live in the shadow of power, to serve in the heart of empire, and to accept that one's own life was no longer one's own. The gates had closed, and with them, the past. Ahead lay only the long corridors of service, the routines of discipline, and the silent companionship of those who shared his fate. And so, the boy who had once trembled in fever, now stood among marble floors and golden halls, his future stretched out before him, in a pattern as rigid as the palace walls themselves. The gates had opened to admit him, and in doing so had closed behind him forever. Life inside the palace settled into a rhythm, a long procession of days shaped not by the desires of the individual but by the needs of the court. For the eunuch, each morning began in silence, broken only by the sound of soft footsteps on stone floors and the faint rustle of cloth as servants prepared themselves for the endless cycle of duties. There was no call to linger in bed, no leisurely choice of how the day might unfold. The palace was a world of order, and every hour, sometimes every moment, belonged to the sovereign. The eunuch had been shaped into a servant, not only through the ritual that altered his body, but also through the relentless routine that consumed his life. His tasks varied depending on rank and assignment. At the lowest level, he might sweep corridors, tend fires or fetch water, his presence barely noticed by those who walked past him. Others served in kitchens, waking before dawn to grind spices, stir pots and prepare meals that would never touch their own lips. Some were placed as doorkeepers, standing in stillness at the thresholds of chambers, their very presence a reminder that the palace was a world of barriers and permissions. For those who showed discipline and intelligence, higher positions might come in time, overseeing treasury stores, delivering confidential messages, or guarding the secluded quarters of the harem. But in every role, silence was the foundation. It was silence that allowed the machinery of the palace to operate without friction. Eunuchs did not speak unless commanded, did not intrude upon the affairs of nobles, did not reveal the secrets they witnessed behind closed doors. They moved like shadows, gliding through halls with the quiet certainty of those who knew their place. Their obedience was absolute, for disobedience could mean punishment or expulsion, and the palace was not a place that easily forgave. This silence was not only an outward rule but an inward shaping of the self. Over time, the eunuch learned to quiet his own thoughts, to push aside memories of the past, to set aside desires that had no place in his new life. He became part of the palace's rhythm, blending into its endless cycles of ceremony and service. Just as the gears of a clock measure time without ever choosing its direction, so too did eunuchs keep the palace turning without altering its course. Their days were long and repetitive, yet within that repetition lay the essence of their power, because they were always present, always listening, always silent. Eunuchs became the unseen keepers of knowledge. They learned who entered which chamber, who spoke to whom, what words were whispered at night, and what gestures betrayed alliances. They did not speak of it openly, but they absorbed it, carrying the palace's secrets as naturally as they carried trays of food or bundles of documents. It was in this silent accumulation of knowledge that the eunuch became essential, for rulers came to depend on them as trusted intermediaries, precisely because they were cut off from family ties and personal ambitions that might otherwise compromise loyalty. Silence, however, came at a cost. The eunuch's life was not his own, and the suppression of individuality became second nature. He dressed as required, walked where instructed, ate when permitted, slept in shared quarters, assigned without preference. The self dissolved into the collective, and the individual man who had once lived outside the palace seemed more and more like a distant dream. His laughter, his childhood games, even the sound of his own name faded, replaced by the identity given to him through service. Even so, within the silence there was a strange endurance. The eunuch discovered that by erasing his individuality, he became indispensable. He was not a rival to nobles, not a competitor for dynastic succession, not a threat to the emperor's lineage. He existed outside those struggles, and so rulers leaned upon him, trusting him to carry out orders without the complication of private ambitions. The eunuch thus became both invisible and vital, both disregarded and necessary, his silence woven into the very structure of imperial rule. The palace itself reinforced this silence. Its architecture was designed to conceal and to separate. Courtyards layered one within another, doors locked behind other doors, rooms sealed away from the public world. To serve in such a space was to learn invisibility, to move without drawing notice, to disappear into walls that swallowed voices and footsteps. In the Forbidden City, eunuchs swept endless marble courtyards that seemed to stretch forever, their labor unnoticed except when it failed. In Topkapi, they drifted through gardens, carrying trays of sherbet or letters sealed with wax, their faces blank masks beneath the bright sunlight of Istanbul. In Byzantium, they crossed mosaic floors beneath domes that glittered with gold, their shadows falling quietly against walls painted with saints and emperors. The eunuch's daily duties may have seemed menial, but over time they became part of something larger, the machinery of empire itself. Every fire tended, every key turned, every message delivered contributed to the smooth operation of rule, and the eunuch's silence, which might have seemed like absence, was in truth a presence of its own. It was a silence that filled the palace halls, a silence that carried secrets, a silence that allowed power to move unimpeded. At the end of each day, when the palace finally settled into darkness, the eunuchs returned to their quarters. These rooms were plain compared to the chambers of nobles, yet they carried their own quiet dignity. There, among others like themselves, they shared a companionship born not of choice but of fate. No words were needed. The silence continued, stretching across the hours of the night, broken only by the faint creak of wooden beams, or the sigh of wind against palace walls. In time, the eunuch no longer thought of silence as absence but as existence itself. It was the rhythm of his days, the condition of his life, the ground upon which all else rested. He had become not only a servant of silence, but silence itself, the invisible current that allowed the palace to function, the unseen breath of empire. And as the years passed, he would come to realize that in this silence lay both his greatest limitation and his greatest strength. For in being denied a voice of his own, he became the vessel of others' voices, the bearer of power that did not belong to him but could never move without him. He was, in the truest sense, a servant of silence, and in that service, he had become part of history's most enduring empires. As the eunuch advanced through the ranks of palace service, the nature of his duties changed. No longer was he only a silent figure sweeping courtyards or bearing trays along marble corridors. Instead, he began to hold keys, to stand watch at thresholds where no ordinary man could pass, and to move within the most guarded spaces of empire. His silence, once a passive habit, now carried the weight of trust. For eunuchs became not merely servants but guardians of secrets, both the physical secrets of rooms and chambers, and the intangible secrets of conversations, alliances, and hidden lives. The placement of eunuchs as guardians of royal women's quarters was perhaps the most distinctive mark of their role. In empire after empire, the harem or inner palace remained an exclusive world, sealed off from outsiders, its doors closed even to high officials or noblemen. The women within were wives, concubines, mothers and daughters of rulers, and through them, the dynastic bloodline was preserved. To guard these chambers with ordinary men would invite suspicion, temptation, and scandal, but eunuchs, by virtue of their altered condition, were viewed as safe custodians. Their presence at the doors of women's quarters ensured that no unpermitted contact could occur, that the lineage of rulers remained unchallenged, and that secrecy itself was maintained as tightly as the bolts on palace doors. In the Ottoman Empire, the most powerful eunuchs were those assigned to the imperial harem of Topkapi Palace. Known as the Kızlar Hassa, or chief black eunuch, this figure commanded immense authority, controlling access to the sultan's mother, the Valide Sultan, and to the women of the court. His duties went beyond mere physical guarding. He managed correspondence, supervised attendance, and acted as an intermediary between the secluded harem and the outside world. In his silence and discretion lay the smooth operation of the dynasty's most private realm. Similarly, in the forbidden city of China, eunuchs guarded the empress's palace and the chambers of imperial consorts. Their watch was not simply about preventing intrusion, but about maintaining the ritual purity of the emperor's household. In the layered courtyards of Beijing, where only the chosen could enter each successive gate, eunuchs marked the thresholds, ensuring that hierarchy and separation were preserved. By controlling access, they also controlled information, for to decide who could approach a chamber was to decide who could whisper in whose ear. Beyond the protection of women's quarters, eunuchs also held responsibility for treasuries and sacred spaces. In Byzantium, eunuchs guarded the emperor's bedchamber, his personal chapel, and the rooms where imperial regalia was stored. In many courts, they carried the keys to treasury chests, libraries, and archives. The symbolism was clear. The eunuch's hand, which could never pass on inheritance to sons, held the objects of inheritance for the empire itself. They were trusted precisely because they had no dynasty of their own to enrich. Their loyalty was imagined as belonging entirely to the throne. Yet with this trust came the burden of secrecy. Eunuchs heard what others were not meant to hear. They knew which consort was favored, which son of the emperor was visited at night, which alliances were whispered in secluded gardens, which treasuries had been unlocked and which scrolls of law had been quietly altered before public announcement. They became living vaults of knowledge, sealed by silence. To betray a secret was unthinkable, for discovery would mean disgrace or death, but to hold it was to carry the invisible weight of empire. This role transformed the eunuch into a paradoxical figure, powerless in himself, yet indispensable as the keeper of others' power. He could not marry or father children, yet he knew more of dynasties and their bloodlines than many ministers. He could not rule openly, yet he could determine who gained access to those who ruled. His identity was shaped by absence, yet that absence became the foundation of trust. Daily life for the eunuch in this role was defined by thresholds. He stood at doors for hours, motionless and watchful, his presence both a barrier and a reassurance. He accompanied rulers through corridors, carrying lamps at night or holding curtains aside by day. He was present when the emperor whispered to his consort, when the sultan conferred with his mother, when the Byzantine basileus prayed in his private chapel. He was there when secrets were spoken, yet he never spoke of them. His silence was the price of survival, but it was also the reason he endured at the heart of empire. The trust placed in eunuchs was not always born of affection, but of necessity. Rulers could not trust nobles who had their own ambitions, nor soldiers who might turn their strength into rebellion. But eunuchs, cut off from lineage, held a unique position. Their loyalty was bound not by love, but by condition. They had been remade for this life, and there was nowhere else to turn. The palace gates had closed behind them, and within those gates, secrecy became their second skin, and yet secrecy was never without risk. To know too much was dangerous, for rulers feared betrayal even from those they trusted most. Some eunuchs fell under suspicion, accused of whispering too closely with rivals, or of passing information where it should not go. Others rose to astonishing heights of influence, guiding imperial policy from behind veils of silence. The line between trusted guardian and shadowed manipulator was thin, and many eunuchs walked it for their entire lives. Still, at the core of their existence remained the same truth. Eunuchs were guardians not only of doors but of silence itself. They held what others could not be permitted to know. They lived on the boundary between visibility and invisibility, between service and power, between presence and absence. They were guardians of secrets in the most literal sense, for within their memories lay the hidden lives of rulers, the unseen corridors of empire, and the fragile line that separated dynasty from collapse. And so, as the eunuch stood at his post, motionless beneath gilded arches or beside heavy wooden doors, he became part of the palace itself, as silent, as enduring, and as filled with hidden knowledge as the walls that surrounded him. The palace was a theatre of authority, and in this theatre, the eunuch occupied a peculiar role. He was neither actor nor audience, neither ruler nor subject in the ordinary sense, but something in between, a silent presence that drifted along the edges of the stage, never speaking his lines, yet always present when the drama unfolded. He saw emperors crowned and kings grow old. He carried lamps into councils where policy was decided. He swept the marble floors after feasts that displayed the wealth of empires. He was everywhere and nowhere, moving through spaces where commoners would never step, yet never permitted to shape events in his own name. His was the life of an observer, a shadow among figures of power. From the gilded throne halls of Byzantium to the hushed corridors of Beijing's Forbidden City, from the tiled courtyards of Topkapi to the echoing stone of medieval European castles, eunuchs watched rulers in their most intimate and unguarded moments. They stood beside thrones during ceremonies, bearing torches or holding royal regalia. They were present in private chambers when emperors exchanged words with their closest consorts, when sultans whispered to their viziers, when kings prayed before icons or relics. They alone bore witness to both the grandeur and the frailty of rulers, the public masks of majesty and the private moments of doubt. To exist in such proximity was both privilege and burden. The eunuch's eyes saw everything, but his voice was bound to silence. He could not interrupt, could not protest, could not claim the stage. His detachment was enforced by the conditions of his life, without family to advocate for him, without heirs to pass his influence down to, without the possibility of claiming a throne. He remained a shadow at the edges of power. He learned to accept the contradiction that defined his role, that he was essential to the functioning of courtly life, and yet excluded from the circle of those who commanded it. There was a rhythm to this shadowed existence. In the mornings, eunuchs accompanied rulers to audiences, preparing chambers, ensuring that processions flowed without disruption, carrying scrolls or jewels as required. At midday they oversaw meals, not eating themselves but standing silently as food was presented, tasting it for poison when commanded. In the afternoons they guarded doors during councils, listening as ministers debated laws and taxes, wars and treaties. At night, they accompanied rulers into private quarters, holding lamps to light the way, then vanishing quietly into corners when conversations became personal. At every moment, they were near, yet never acknowledged as equal participants. And yet, in that distance there was a kind of clarity. Eunuchs became watchers of history, witnesses to events that others could only imagine. They saw dynasties rise and fall, alliances made and broken, victories celebrated and defeats mourned. They noticed the trembling of a ruler's hand when he signed decrees, the slight pause in his speech when he hesitated over war, the fatigue in his eyes when he returned from council. To the eunuch, who was forced into detachment, rulers appeared not only as sovereigns but as men, fragile and fleeting like all others. This perspective set him apart, for while nobles dreamed of crowns and generals of victories, the eunuch learned to see power as something transient, something that shifted as easily as the wind in palace courtyards. The life of a shadow was not without irony. Eunuchs were often painted in the language of weakness and absence, castrated, voiceless, detached, and yet they outlasted many of the powerful men they served. Emperors died, sultans were dethroned, kings fell in battle, but the eunuch remained, moving quietly to serve the next in line. He did not claim succession, but succession always passed through his watchful gaze. In this way he became a constant presence in the palace, a thread of continuity that endured beyond the fleeting brilliance of rulers. But this constancy came at the cost of self. The eunuch was trained not to intervene, not to leave a trace of his own will upon the events he witnessed. His memories became heavy with secrets he could never share, his thoughts burdened with observations he could not speak. Detachment was not a choice but a condition of survival. To voice an opinion was to risk accusation of manipulation. To lean too closely toward one faction was to invite suspicion. The safest path was always silence, to watch, to serve, to remain a shadow. Yet shadows can shape spaces in subtle ways. A look withheld, a key turned at the right moment, an introduction permitted or delayed. Such acts could alter the course of events, even if the eunuch never claimed responsibility. By standing at the threshold of power but never fully within it, eunuchs learned to shape history indirectly, their influence woven not into proclamations, but into the unseen workings of the court. And while chronicles often ignored them, they were there, in the background of every great moment, their silent presence forming part of the story. The detachment of the eunuch was also reflected in his inner world. While others dreamed of legacy, he dreamed of endurance. His purpose was not to carve his name into stone, but to survive the passing tides of dynasties. He learned patience in a way that few others could. Decades could pass in service, decades in which he remained the same while rulers aged and fell away. This perspective, born of voicelessness, gave him a kind of timelessness, as though he were less a person than a fragment of the palace itself. In the shadows of power, the eunuch found a strange kind of belonging. He did not belong to family or lineage, nor to the city outside the palace walls. He belonged to the palace itself, to its gates and courtyards, its chambers and hidden rooms. He was the shadow that moved within it, as inseparable from it as the echo of footsteps in a hall. His detachment was his role, his survival, and ultimately his identity. And so, day after day, year after year, he remained, the watcher who never spoke, the servant who saw everything, the shadow at the heart of empire. His life was not celebrated in chronicles, not remembered in monuments, not sung in poetry, but it endured, quietly, in the spaces between rulers, in the silence between decrees, in the unseen thread that bound empires together across generations. Loyalty was the invisible chain that bound the eunuch to the palace, a chain at once fragile and unbreakable. On the surface it appeared simple. He was a servant of the ruler, dedicated wholly to the person on the throne, entrusted because he had no wife, no children, no dynasty of his own that might tempt him toward ambition. And yet, within the labyrinth of court life, loyalty was never so clear. It was tested constantly, bent under the strain of intrigue, twisted by whispers, and blurred by the shifting tides of power. The eunuch's life was defined by this delicate balancing act to serve faithfully, but also to survive in a world where suspicion was as common as air. Every court was a maze of competing interests. In Byzantium, powerful aristocratic families plotted marriages and alliances to expand their influence. In the Ottoman court, viziers and pashas jostled for favor, whispering into the sultan's ear with promises of loyalty while preparing networks of their own supporters. In China's Forbidden City, scholar officials of the Confucian bureaucracy eyed eunuchs with disdain, fearing their growing influence while scheming to limit it. The eunuch was caught in the middle of these rivalries. To lean too close to one side meant alienating another. To stand entirely neutral risked seeming cold or untrustworthy. Loyalty was always under question, and so it had to be performed, enacted through gestures of humility, visible service, and silent presence. But the performance of loyalty did not always protect against suspicion. Rulers themselves, though reliant on eunuchs, often feared them. They wondered whether the one who carried their secrets might someday reveal them, whether the servant at their side was truly dedicated, or quietly resentful. To the very closeness that made eunuchs invaluable, also made them dangerous in the eyes of those they served. A word overheard, a glance held too long, a hesitation at the wrong moment. Such small things could be interpreted as signs of betrayal. Many eunuchs learned to live with this constant scrutiny, smoothing their every gesture into one of submission, erasing traces of self until they became reflections of their master's will. And yet, beneath the surface, loyalty was a far more complex burden. Eunuchs were loyal not only to rulers but to the palace itself, to the institution that had shaped their existence. They became attached to the rhythm of court life, the patterns of ceremony, the familiarity of marble floors and hidden courtyards. Even when dynasties changed, even when a new ruler ascended the throne, the eunuch's loyalty to the palace endured. He adapted to new masters, because the palace was his only home, the place where his life had meaning. This loyalty was not emotional, but structural, woven into the very conditions of his survival. But survival also required compromise. There were times when eunuchs had to choose silence over honesty, or complicity over resistance. When emperors demanded cruel acts, they carried them out. When sultans ordered surveillance of their own family, eunuchs obeyed. When kings suspected their ministers and demanded spies, eunuchs provided whispers. Each act could be justified as loyalty to the throne, but in the shadows, such choices blurred into betrayal of others who trusted them. The eunuch learned that loyalty, in the palace, was never pure. it was always entangled with self-preservation, with fear, with the necessity of obedience. In some cases, loyalty itself became a form of power. Rulers, surrounded by flatterers and rivals, longed for servants they could trust absolutely. The eunuch's loyalty, displayed through decades of service, could elevate him to extraordinary influence. Some rose to command armies, to manage treasuries, to govern provinces, all because their loyalty was seen as incorruptible. But this elevation was double-edged. The more trusted a eunuch became, the more he drew the envy of ministers and the suspicion of nobles. To be loyal and powerful was to be admired and feared in equal measure, and often to court a tragic downfall. There were countless stories of loyalty rewarded and loyalty punished. In Byzantium, eunuchs sometimes rose to the rank of parakomumenos, the one who literally slept beside the emperor, a mark of ultimate trust. In the Ottoman Empire, the chief black eunuch, the Kislar Asa, wielded authority rivaling viziers, overseeing the imperial harem and sometimes shaping succession itself. In Ming China, eunuchs like Wei Zhongxian became infamous for their power, ruling in the name of loyalty, but despised as traitors by scholar officials. Each of these figures walked the same line: loyalty as devotion, loyalty as service, loyalty as betrayal. The burden of loyalty weighed heavily on the eunuch's inner life. He knew that no matter how faithfully he served, his devotion might be questioned at any moment. He had no lineage to defend him, no clan to intervene on his behalf. His fate depended entirely on the shifting moods of rulers and the suspicions of courtiers. A life of loyalty could end in dismissal, exile, or even execution, simply because others chose to interpret his service as betrayal. To live under such uncertainty was to live with constant caution, with every word measured, every gesture controlled, and yet, within that caution, loyalty also became a form of identity. It gave the eunuch a sense of purpose in a life stripped of other roles. He was not a husband, not a father, not a clan elder. He was a servant of the throne, loyal to the end. This loyalty filled the silence left by what he had lost. It was heavy, yes, but it was also sustaining, giving him a reason to endure the long corridors of palace life. The blurred lines of loyalty shaped not only the eunuch's service, but the very nature of palace politics. In a world where trust was scarce, where betrayal seemed inevitable, the eunuch's loyalty became a mirror, reflecting the fragility of power itself. For rulers who demanded absolute devotion, yet lived in fear of treachery, the eunuch embodied both the answer and the problem. He was loyal precisely because he had no family, but this very condition made him a reminder of how fragile and unnatural such devotion truly was. Thus, in the palace, loyalty was always heavy. It was not the loyalty of comrades in battle or kin in a household, but the loyalty of silence, of endurance, of service without reward. It was a loyalty that demanded the erasure of self, the surrender of ambition, the acceptance of suspicion as a daily companion. And through it all, the eunuch remained, loyal to ruler and palace, bound by chains of duty and necessity, carrying the weight of devotion that could never truly be free of betrayal. Influence rarely announced itself loudly in the palace. It crept in through shadows, it lingered in the folds of curtains, and it moved in hushed tones behind closed doors. For eunuchs, influence was never an official power granted by decree, but rather something accumulated through trust, observation, and proximity. They were the ones who stood beside rulers when others were dismissed, who walked with them in the solitude of gardens, who attended their rest in chambers where no ministers or generals were permitted. In such spaces, beyond the formality of court, words were spoken not as commands but as thoughts, tentative, uncertain, seeking reassurance. It was there that the eunuch's voice, if carefully used, could alter the course of dynasties. This influence was subtle, almost invisible, yet its weight was immense. In Byzantium, eunuchs held the ears of emperors, whispering advice shaped not by personal ambition for children or family legacy, but by a singular loyalty to the palace itself. They knew which general could be trusted, which alliance was fragile, which noble family harbored resentment. Their knowledge came not from public assemblies, but from corridors and kitchens, from overheard conversations in harem quarters, from fragments of letters intercepted by chance. Such knowledge was power, but it was never wielded like a sword. It was carried softly, spoken quietly, offered in a moment when an emperor, weary of conflict, leaned on the only figure who seemed without ulterior motive. In China, eunuchs became indispensable, precisely because their lives unfolded in spaces that scholar officials could not enter. The Forbidden City was more than a palace. It was a world within a world, and eunuchs were its breath. They controlled access to the emperor, regulating who could present petitions and who was turned away. A single delay, a missing document, a rescheduled audience, all such acts were invisible on the grand stage, but decisive in shaping policy. A minister who never gained the emperor's ear could not influence decisions. In this way, eunuchs became gatekeepers, and their whispers shaped not only who was heard, but what was heard. The Ottoman court revealed the same quiet pattern. The Kızlar, the chief black eunuch, presided over the harem, but also acted as a political channel between the secluded sultan and the vast machinery of empire. His influence was exercised not in public assemblies, but in choosing which letters reached the sultan's hands, which petitions were quietly set aside, which voices were softened in retelling. Influence here was not about issuing commands, but about controlling the flow of information, ensuring that what the ruler knew, or did not know, aligned with the eunuch's careful guidance. But this influence was never without risk. To be seen shaping decisions openly was dangerous. It stirred the jealousy of viziers, the anger of ministers, the suspicion of rulers themselves. Eunuchs had to master the art of invisibility, planting ideas without seeming to do so, ensuring that when a ruler spoke, the suggestion appeared to be his own. A whispered caution in the late hours, a reminder of past betrayals, a suggestion framed as humble concern. These were the tools of influence. To push too hard was to invite ruin. To guide too gently was to risk being forgotten. Thus, influence was always measured, never direct, carried more like a breath than a voice. The consequences of these whispers, however, could be vast. Entire dynasties were shaped by them. Wars were declared or avoided, not only by generals and kings, but by eunuchs who urged caution or encouraged boldness. Successions were decided when eunuchs influenced which prince was favored, which heir received access, which rival was quietly isolated. Even policies that touched ordinary lives, tax reforms, grain distributions, punishments of rebellion, could be shifted by the unseen hands of eunuchs who steered rulers toward mercy or severity. They were invisible authors of decisions written in the name of kings. Examples echo across history. In Ming China, eunuchs like Wei Zhongxian controlled access to the emperor and used their position to dominate court politics, reshaping appointments, punishing rivals, and even influencing ritual practices. In Byzantium, eunuchs such as Basil Lecapennios, himself the illegitimate son of an emperor, rose to extraordinary prominence, shaping imperial policy for decades under multiple rulers. In the Ottoman Empire, the chief black eunuch's influence was so profound that European ambassadors often sought his favor, knowing that treaties and decisions could hinge on his whispers. In each case, the pattern was the same. Eunuchs were not rulers, yet their shadows fell across every decision rulers made. For the eunuch himself, this influence was both privilege and burden. It gave him purpose, placing him at the heart of decisions that shaped nations, but it also made him a target. Ministers despised his quiet role, seeing in his whispers the corruption of rightful governance. Generals scorned his influence, resenting that wars and strategies could be decided by someone who never wielded a sword. Even the people sometimes cursed eunuchs, imagining them as sinister manipulators behind royal failures. The eunuch lived under this suspicion, knowing that every whisper, every influence, might someday be used against him. And yet, despite suspicion, rulers returned to their eunuchs again and again. Perhaps it was the intimacy of trust, the knowledge that these servants had no families to plot dynasties of their own. Perhaps it was the silence they offered, listening without judgment when rulers spoke of fears and doubts. Or perhaps it was simply the fact that eunuchs, having nothing else, gave their entire lives to the palace, their loyalty woven into its walls. Whatever the reason, influence lingered in their hands, not as a public authority but as a constant whispered presence. In this way, eunuchs embodied a paradox. They were powerless yet powerful, silent yet shaping voices, invisible yet unavoidable. Their influence was never written in laws or decrees, yet it ran through the veins of empires like an unseen current, guiding the hand of rulers without ever claiming credit. It was this paradox that defined their existence, forever in the background, forever shaping destinies that would never bear their names. And as dynasties rose and fell, as rulers came and went, the whispers endured, passed from one eunuch to another, carried in the silence of chambers, and the long echoing halls of palaces, unseen but never absent. If influence gave the eunuch a presence within the palace, it did not erase the hollow silence of his personal world. Behind the gold-leaf doors, beneath the whisper of authority, there was an emptiness that no position or title could truly fill. Eunuchs were men who belonged nowhere. They had no families waiting for them in ancestral homes, no wives to share their evenings, no children to inherit their names, and no bloodline to extend into the future. Their existence was a circle that always folded back into the palace. To others, they were useful; to themselves they were unfinished, as though part of their humanity had been traded away for proximity to power. The loneliness of a eunuch's life stretched beyond the absence of family. In societies where identity was woven tightly with kinship and lineage, to be childless was to exist outside the very pattern of belonging. In China, Confucian thought held the family as the fundamental unit of society, with obligations of filial piety flowing both upward to ancestors and downward to descendants. Eunuchs, severed from the ability to create new generations, stood outside that order. They could honor their ancestors, yes, but they would never be honored in return. Their deaths often meant quiet burials without descendants to tend graves, without offerings of food or incense, without memory carried forward by future generations. It was as though their line ended at birth, leaving them suspended in a space where life was present but legacy was denied. In Byzantium and in the courts of the Ottomans, this absence echoed in similar ways. Nobility prided itself on dynasties, on marriages that bound families together, on sons who carried names into history. Eunuchs, no matter how high they rose, no matter what power they held, could never belong to that rhythm. They could accumulate wealth, they could build homes, they could even sponsor churches or mosques, but they could not carry a family line. And in societies where lineage was synonymous with immortality, eunuchs were destined to vanish more quickly, their memories swallowed by time. Yet isolation was not only social, it was also personal. The daily rhythms of life reminded eunuchs of what was absent. Festivals meant to celebrate marriages and children marked them as outsiders. Conversations in corridors about family affairs or inheritance passed over them, as though they were ghosts. Even the physical spaces of palaces reinforced their exclusion. Eunuchs slept in quarters apart, neither with soldiers nor with ministers, neither with nobles nor with slaves. They belonged to no category, and so they lived between them all. Identity for a eunuch, then, was not anchored in blood, but in service. Since they could not define themselves as husbands or fathers, they became defined by their loyalty to rulers. Their names were remembered, if at all, in connection to the palace: the eunuch of the harem, the eunuch of the emperor's chambers, the eunuch of the treasury. To exist was to serve, and to serve was to exist. Stripped of other roles, service became their mirror, the only reflection they could see of themselves. This reliance on service as identity created a fragile sense of self. A eunuch's worth lasted only as long as he remained useful. Illness, old age, or the fall of a ruler could erase decades of loyalty in an instant. A new emperor might dismiss old attendants, reducing them from voices of influence to silent shadows wandering the edges of the palace. Without family or descendants to shelter them, retired or dismissed eunuchs often faded into obscurity, some living quietly in monasteries, others drifting into poverty. Their entire sense of belonging could collapse the moment the palace no longer required them. The mirror of isolation, however, was not always one of despair. Some eunuchs, aware of their exclusion, turned their solitude into a kind of strength. Without family obligations, they were free to dedicate themselves entirely to the palace. Without heirs, they sometimes donated wealth to religious institutions, ensuring that prayers would be said for their souls even if no children remembered them. In Byzantium, eunuchs often became patrons of monasteries, finding in the cloister a reflection of their own celibate existence. In China, eunuchs sometimes commissioned shrines or charitable works, leaving behind physical traces of their presence even if their bloodlines had ended. These acts were small gestures of permanence, a way of carving identity into stone when it could not be carried in flesh. But still, the loneliness lingered. It was a quiet loneliness, not always visible to others, but carried within the eunuch himself. It surfaced in moments of reflection, when festivals filled with families reminded him of his separation, or when he stood in the chamber of a dying ruler and realized that his loyalty had bound him to someone else's legacy, not his own. It surfaced in the silence of nights when the palace grew still, and the eunuch, lying in his narrow bed, listened to the faint echoes of laughter from distant halls and wondered where he truly belonged. This was the paradox of their privilege, to stand closer to kings than most men ever could, yet to stand apart from the ordinary bonds that made life whole. The palace was their family, but the palace was also their prison. Their loyalty gave them identity, but it also erased it. To live as a eunuch was to carry influence in one hand and emptiness in the other, to shape dynasties yet leave no trace of one's own. And as years passed, as emperors aged and sultans fell, as palaces filled with new voices and new attendants, the eunuch's reflection in the mirror grew dimmer, his isolation deeper, until he was little more than a shadow moving through halls where he once held influence, his existence remembered only in whispers. For the eunuch, whose life had been reshaped by palace walls and stripped of family ties, religion often became a second home, a place where service took on a sacred quality. In the ancient and medieval worlds, the divide between political power and spiritual authority was rarely clean, and eunuchs, who lived in the very heart of courts, inevitably became entwined with the rituals of worship that underpinned empires. Whether carrying incense into Byzantine chapels, unlocking doors to the mosques of Istanbul, or overseeing offerings in the temples of Ming China, eunuchs became as much guardians of faith as they were of rulers. In Byzantium, where Christian rituals saturated the rhythms of imperial life, eunuchs played prominent roles in the great churches and monasteries of the empire. Their voices, often preserved by the castration that prevented the deepening of pitch, gave them a distinctive place in the choirs of Hagia Sophia and other sacred basilicas. High, clear tones rose into the domes of Byzantine churches, echoing off mosaics of Christ Pantocrator and the Virgin Mary. Eunuchs were not merely singers, however. They also served as attendants during liturgies, carrying candles, presenting the Gospels, and preparing altars for the Eucharist. Their condition of celibacy was interpreted by some theologians as a form of purity, aligning them with the angelic hosts who themselves lived without fleshly desire. This symbolic connection gave them a spiritual prestige that paradoxically coexisted with the stigma of their mutilation. In monasteries as well, eunuchs found a kind of refuge, since they had no heirs and no worldly family to return to. Many retired eunuchs entered cloisters, bringing with them wealth accumulated in palace service. Some became patrons, endowing monasteries with libraries, land or chapels. Others lived out their final years in quiet devotion, finding in the cloister a mirror of their own condition, celibate, detached from worldly bonds, and bound to service. Within these walls, the eunuch's life of isolation could be transformed into one of spiritual focus, a slow rhythm of prayer that made sense of solitude. In the Islamic world, eunuchs held unique roles within the most sacred of sites. From the Abbasid Caliphate onward, eunuchs were appointed as custodians of the two holiest mosques of Islam, the Masjid al-Haram in Mecca and the Prophet's Mosque in Medina. For centuries, eunuchs guarded the Kaaba, unlocked its doors, swept its floors, and oversaw the sacred cloth, the kiswa, that covered it. Their lives became bound to ritual care, and pilgrims from across the Islamic world would see their silent figures tending to the sanctuaries. The logic of their placement mirrored that of the palace. Since they had no families, they were seen as more dedicated to service. Since they were cut off from earthly lineage, They were imagined as impartial guardians of divine space. Their presence endured into modern times, with the last eunuchs of the harem remembered well into the 20th century. In the Ottoman Empire, eunuchs also played religious roles closer to the Sultan himself. The chief black eunuch, while overseeing the imperial harem, often served as a patron of mosques, schools and religious charities. His immense influence allowed him to direct endowments, ensuring that Quranic schools were funded, mosques restored, and pilgrimages supported. Some Ottoman eunuchs became remembered less for their palace intrigue than for the mosques they built, or the fountains they endowed, their names inscribed into stone even though their family lines had vanished. China too saw eunuchs bound to religious practice, though often in ways that reflected local traditions. In the Ming dynasty, eunuchs were deeply involved in Taoist and Buddhist rituals performed at court. They tended to shrines, managed temple finances, and organized offerings made by the emperor. Some became patrons of Buddhist monasteries, funding the carving of scriptures or the building of statues. At the same time, however, their spiritual role could be shadowed by suspicion. Confucian officials, wary of eunuchs' influence, accused them of corrupting religious practices for personal power. In certain periods, eunuchs were charged with overseeing state sacrifices to heaven and earth, placing them directly at the intersection of cosmic order and imperial authority. What unites these traditions is the symbolic role eunuchs played, liminal beings who stood between worlds. They were not fully part of family life, yet they held the keys to dynasties. They were not priests, yet they served within temples. They were not angels, yet their bodies set them apart from ordinary men. Their presence in sacred rituals reflected the same paradox as their place in palaces, excluded in one sense, indispensable in another. The daily rituals they oversaw carried immense weight. A eunuch unlocking the Kaaba's door in Mecca was not simply performing a physical act, but opening the holiest site in Islam to the faithful. A eunuch leading a choir in Hagia Sophia was not merely singing but lifting prayers into the vaulted heavens. A eunuch burning incense in a Taoist temple was not only maintaining ritual order but sustaining the link between emperor and cosmos. Their gestures, quiet and methodical, bound the sacred and the political together. Yet, the mirror of isolation was never far. Participation in ritual did not erase loneliness, but deepened its reflection. To carry sacred keys but never pass them to sons, to sponsor monasteries but never be remembered by descendants, to sing in choirs but never have a family to hear one's voice. These were the silent contradictions that haunted eunuchs in religious roles. Their spirituality was often public, visible to thousands, yet their own faith was lived privately, shaped by solitude. And so, across empires, eunuchs became figures of faith as much as of politics. They stood at altars, at shrines, at tombs, and at holy gates. They were guardians not only of kings and queens but also of temples and mosques. Their lives, though marked by absence, became woven into rituals meant to bind heaven and earth together, and in this service, they found not lineage, but perhaps a form of meaning, a way of inscribing their names in stone and memory, even as their bloodlines remained forever silent. Time was perhaps the one master that eunuchs could not serve, nor control, nor persuade. For those who lived within palaces, who bowed to rulers and bore keys to holy sanctuaries, time remained the unchanging horizon, always advancing, always reshaping the body. The eunuch, so carefully cut away from the usual course of family life, experienced aging in ways that were at once ordinary and strangely distinct. His body bore marks that made him unlike other men, and as the years passed, those differences became more pronounced, more visible, and more isolating. The castration that had defined his life also shaped his aging. Without the surge of testosterone that marked other men's development, the eunuch's body aged differently. Beardless faces, which in youth gave them a boyish appearance, carried into old age a kind of arrested adolescence. The skin, often smoother than that of other men, wrinkled more slowly, giving eunuchs a reputation for unusual longevity. In China, imperial doctors observed that eunuchs could live longer than their counterparts, sometimes reaching into their 80s or 90s in an era when few lived so long. Yet the gift of extended years was not without a shadow. The same procedure that gave them youthfulness also left their bones weaker, their muscles less firm, their bodies prone to fragility in later years. In Byzantium, chroniclers noted the strange paradox of aged eunuchs. They were ever present in courts, sometimes serving emperors long after the monarch's own sons had grown and died. To serve 4, 5, or even 6 emperors across decades meant that eunuchs became living archives of dynastic memory. They alone remembered what an emperor's grandfather had decreed, what ceremony had been performed, what betrayal had been whispered. Their memories filled the gaps of written records, and their presence alone could anchor a court in traditions otherwise forgotten. With time, they became less individuals than repositories, silent witnesses who carried empires within their recollections. In the Ottoman Empire, eunuchs who survived into old age often retired from the harem into quieter lives, though many retained titles and stipends. The chief black eunuchs, those who had ruled the inner palace, sometimes spent their later years as patrons of schools or builders of mosques. Age in this sense gave them dignity, a softening of suspicion. No longer viewed as dangerous rivals, they could live as benefactors, remembered not for intrigues but for fountains, endowments or marble inscriptions left behind. Yet, even here, aging carried a bitter truth. Their wealth might build monuments, but their bloodline ended with them. No sons would carry their names, no daughters would care for their graves. Aging also deepened the solitude of eunuchs in less visible ways. While other servants of the palace might eventually leave to marry or to retire with families, eunuchs had no such option. Their old age was often spent surrounded only by others like themselves, fellow eunuchs who too bore the silence of childlessness. Within their quarters, conversations must have circled back to the same memories, the same rituals, the same rulers they had all seen pass by. Their community was built not by kinship, but by shared exclusion. And in old age, that exclusion grew heavier. In Ming and Qing China, eunuchs sometimes outlived emperors, becoming unsettling reminders of the passing of dynasties. An emperor might die young, while his eunuch attendants lingered, carrying into the next reign the secrets of a palace long gone. A eunuch who had served the Wanli emperor could still be alive under his successor, a breathing reminder of the past in a court desperate to look forward. This longevity gave them power but also suspicion, for to remember too much was to be seen as dangerous. Still, the old eunuchs often carried a kind of melancholy dignity, their lives a testimony to service that stretched across generations. Physical decline was another constant companion. Many eunuchs developed conditions unique to their altered bodies, frail bones, higher risks of fractures and weakened muscles. The absence of hormonal changes that shaped other men meant their bodies aged along unfamiliar paths, neither wholly male nor female, but something in between. Chronic pain could accompany them, and for those who had once been robust guardians or efficient scribes, the frailty of old age was a heavy burden. And yet, because their role was so tied to service rather than physical labor, many could continue working even as their bodies weakened. A eunuch could hold keys, manage documents, or sing in choirs long after soldiers or courtiers had been forced to retire. The burden of time was not only physical but psychological. To serve in a palace for decades meant seeing faces come and go, hearing names rise and fall, and realizing, with quiet bitterness, that one's own presence was always temporary yet strangely permanent. Eunuchs saw children born in the harem, watched them grow into rulers, then buried them, only to serve their successors. They watched queens rise, empresses fall, concubines fade from beauty, and all the while they remained. Each new ruler saw them as part of the furniture of power, always there, unchanged. In this way, eunuchs carried not only their own age, but also the ages of others, a layered memory that made them simultaneously invisible and unforgettable. For some, time brought a measure of peace. In old age, the ambitions of younger years faded, and what remained was ritual, unlocking doors, lighting lamps, carrying incense, arranging documents. These became not burdens but rhythms. The slow passage of days could resemble monastic life, a meditative repetition that dulled loneliness. For others, however, time was a crueler weight, reminding them each day of what was missing. no sons visiting, no grandchildren playing, no legacy to soften the silence of death. As centuries passed, the eunuchs themselves became symbols of time's strange endurance. In paintings, chronicles, and travelers' accounts, they appear as ghostly figures, often older than the emperors they served, their smooth faces carrying the contradictions of youth and age, their bodies bent by decades of service. They were reminders that dynasties themselves were not eternal, that rulers aged and fell, but eunuchs, silent and patient, continued to serve, even when their names were forgotten. And so the burden of time for eunuchs was not simply the aging of the body but the weight of memory, the heaviness of having seen too much, remembered too much, and outlived too many. They were men without heirs who nonetheless bore the histories of dynasties, silent witnesses to the fact that even kings were subject to the same passing of years. The life of a eunuch was meant to be one of obedience, of silence, of submission to the throne, but even silence could fray, and even obedience could bend. Across centuries and empires, the role designed to strip men of lineage and ambition sometimes failed to extinguish the human desire for power, recognition, and control. For all the laws, rituals, and expectations, history leaves behind certain moments when eunuchs stepped beyond their designated station, carving out spaces where they defied the kings they served, manipulated dynasties, or in rare cases, took up arms and directed the course of empires. These instances were unsettling, precisely because they disrupted the image rulers wanted to project, that eunuchs neutered and voiceless could never threaten them. In Byzantium, where eunuchs filled nearly every level of imperial administration, rebellion was not always a matter of open revolt, but of subtle manipulation that led to outcomes no emperor had intended. Eunuchs like Joseph Bringas, who served as Paracomomenos, keeper of the imperial bedchamber, during the reign of Romanos II, in the 10th century, wielded immense influence. Bringas orchestrated alliances and held authority so tightly that his position became almost indistinguishable from that of the emperor himself. When Romanos II died, Bringas attempted to hold power against military leaders like Nicephorus Phocas. Although eventually defeated, his attempt revealed the fragile line between servant and master, between keeper of the chamber and ruler of the state. His maneuvering was not rebellion in the traditional sense of banners raised and swords drawn, but it was rebellion nonetheless, an effort to seize power within a structure designed to keep him subservient. China, too, offers examples where eunuchs crossed into the realm of kingship itself. During the Ming dynasty, eunuchs rose to levels of power that unsettled both scholar officials and emperors. The most famous of these was Zheng He, the great admiral who led vast treasure fleets in the early 15th century. Though Zheng He did not rebel against his emperor, his extraordinary role, commanding fleets, negotiating with foreign rulers, and carrying imperial authority across oceans, was itself a kind of rebellion against the narrow roles eunuchs were meant to play. He became a figure larger than the court had ever imagined, a eunuch whose name carried across continents. Yet, other eunuchs of the Ming court veered toward manipulation rather than exploration. Figures like Wei Zhongxian in the 17th century virtually ruled the empire in place of the emperor, using networks of spies, informants, and loyal followers to suppress rivals. His dominance was so complete that temples were built in his honor, and his name struck fear across China. Eventually, his fall was as dramatic as his rise. Once the emperor who favored him died, his enemies moved quickly, and Wei Zhongxian ended his life in disgrace. But the memory of his rebellion against the natural order of hierarchy lingered, a warning to future dynasties of what eunuchs might become if left unchecked. The Ottoman Empire, too, produced eunuchs who stepped beyond their appointed roles. The chief black eunuch, or Kızlar, held immense influence over the imperial harem, and by extension over the sultan himself. While not leading armies in the field, they could make or break political careers, direct appointments, and manipulate the flow of palace politics to such an extent that their hand could be felt across the empire. Some became kingmakers in all but name, ensuring that certain princes rose to prominence, while others were quietly silenced or left in obscurity. Their rebellion was not one of swords but of whispers, yet whispers, in the chambers of power, could prove more devastating than any weapon. Beyond the major empires, smaller kingdoms and regions also bore witness to eunuchs who defied their roles. In the Abbasid Caliphate, eunuchs at times commanded armies, trusted more than generals who might build dynasties of their own. Al-Mutasim, an Abbasid caliph in the 9th century, entrusted his eunuch Itak with significant military responsibilities, a delegation that blurred the lines between servant and sovereign power. Itak rose so high that his influence rivaled that of the caliph's own family, yet his prominence also stirred resentment, and his eventual downfall showed how precarious such rebellion always was. For a eunuch to rise meant walking a path filled with envy and suspicion, where any misstep could mean execution. In each of these cases, rebellion was not always open or dramatic, but often slow, creeping and subtle. It was a rebellion of presence, of daring to step where rulers had decreed they should not. And because eunuchs carried no family line, no heirs, their rebellions were often fueled, not by dynastic ambition, but by the desire for recognition, for survival, or simply for the exercise of power in a life otherwise deprived of it. Yet history also records the fear such moments inspired. To rulers, eunuchs were meant to be safe precisely because they had no heirs, no reason to build dynasties of their own. When one of them grew too powerful, the sense of betrayal cut deeper, as if the very foundation of palace trust had been undermined. When Wei Zhongxian dominated the Ming court, when Bringis plotted in Byzantium, when Kızlar dictated appointments in the Ottoman palace, rulers saw not just an ambitious servant but the collapse of the very order that justified keeping eunuchs close. Their rebellions were more terrifying because they came from those meant to be voiceless, shadows who were never supposed to step into the light. And so the moments of rebellion became part of the broader mythology of eunuchs. They reminded rulers that control could never be absolute, that even those bound by ritual and mutilation still carried the human desire to shape destiny. Some eunuchs fell swiftly, crushed by the rulers they defied. Others lingered, leaving legacies that haunted dynasties for centuries. Or what bound them all was the unsettling truth that power could never be fully contained, not even in those whose bodies had been reshaped to prevent it. As time moved forward, each generation of rulers remembered these examples, using them as justification to curtail eunuch power, or to watch them with suspicion. Yet the paradox remained. Rulers needed eunuchs, trusted them, relied on them, and in doing so continually opened the door to the very rebellions they feared. And so the story flows from moments of rebellion back into the deeper currents of palace life, where power might flare brightly for a time, but isolation and silence always returned. Because for every eunuch who dared to manipulate thrones or command armies, countless others lived and died in obscurity, their rebellions never spoken, their voices never heard. For all the closeness to power, all the whispered secrets in marble chambers, and all the steps that echoed through endless corridors of polished stone, there remained another world outside the palace gates, a world that seemed at once near and impossibly far. Eunuchs, though bound by ritual and duty, were not entirely cut off from the sight of ordinary life. They passed through courtyards, escorted rulers along city streets, stood guard at ceremonial parades, or simply caught fleeting glimpses through latticed windows of what unfolded beyond the boundaries of empire. These rare moments, though brief, pressed deeply on the imagination of men who were otherwise stripped of lineage and home. For in the movements of the marketplace, the laughter of children, or the sight of a family gathered around a modest meal, they saw not only the vibrancy of life, but also the shadow of their own absence from it. In Byzantium, where eunuchs were woven into nearly every fibre of state administration, ceremonial processions offered such glimpses. The empire's rulers paraded through Constantinople's streets, surrounded by attendants who managed the grandeur of spectacle. Eunuchs often walked in close proximity to the emperor, holding regalia or standing as silent symbols of imperial majesty. From their stations they could look outward at the crowds that lined the Mise, the city's central avenue, where merchants, artisans and common folk pressed forward for a sight of the imperial pageantry. The cheers, the waving of cloths, the sound of families calling children to catch a glimpse, these were the noises of another world. The eunuch, tasked with ensuring order, might allow his eyes to rest for a moment on a father lifting his child to see the emperor's carriage or a mother pressing fruit into the hands of her little one. Such sights stirred quiet pangs that could never be spoken, because they carried the ache of what had been denied. In China, The life of eunuchs was even more firmly bound within palace walls, particularly within the Forbidden City. Yet even there, daily rituals occasionally brought them to gates or outer courtyards, where the faint sounds of the city reached them. Bells from temples, vendors calling their wares, the clatter of horse carts on stone. All these formed the distant hum of life beyond. Some eunuchs were sent on errands or dispatched as imperial messengers, moving through the city under official duty. For them, the experience of walking through streets alive with commerce and kinship was a strange mixture of presence and distance. They could see bakeries steaming with morning buns, hear women bargaining for cloth, or watch children chasing each other in the dust, but always with the knowledge that none of it belonged to them. They returned to the palace not only with supplies or messages, but also with the ghost of those sights still clinging to memory, reminders of a freedom their bodies and roles had forever severed. The Ottoman court provided another version of this tension. Eunuchs, particularly the chief black eunuchs, moved between the palace and the city as intermediaries of royal will. When they left the walls of Topkapi Palace, they encountered the bustle of Istanbul's spice markets thick with scent, narrow alleys echoing with the hammer of blacksmiths, ferries drifting across the Bosphorus. They were part of the fabric of the empire, yet apart from it, their very presence marking them as different. Ordinary people watched them pass, some with awe at their proximity to the Sultan, others with quiet unease at their altered state. Yet for the eunuchs themselves, the city was a reminder of what had been traded for that nearness to the Sultan's ear. To walk past families gathered at fountains or young couples strolling along the harbour was to witness the simple privileges of human continuity that were denied to them. These glimpses of ordinary life were not always peaceful, for they also underscored a loneliness that grew sharper with time. Eunuchs might see festivals, weddings and births, moments when communities came together to celebrate the passage of life. But in watching, they were reminded that no son would carry their name, no daughter would light their home with laughter, no partner would share the intimacies of daily routine. To witness life beyond the palace was to confront the absence of those small joys, and yet paradoxically, to also cherish them at a distance. The historians who chronicled these roles often overlooked such inner worlds, preferring to record the political intrigues and the power struggles. Yet in the silent observation of ordinary people, there is another truth. Eunuchs remained human, capable of longing, nostalgia, and the aching awareness of separation. In some memoirs that survive from late imperial China, eunuchs described their sorrow at seeing children play, confessing that the sight reopened wounds left by the transformation of their youth. These confessions did not carry anger so much as resignation, a weary acceptance that their path had diverged irreversibly from the one most others walk. And still, these glimpses brought a kind of meaning. By watching ordinary life, eunuchs held a mirror to their own existence, a reminder of what had been surrendered, but also a measure of the bargain they had struck. For while they lost family, they gained access to halls where no ordinary person could tread. While others lived free in the marketplace, they stood beside emperors, sultans and caliphs. To some, this was a cruel irony. To others it was a destiny accepted, a trade of one kind of closeness for another. In the slow passage of years, the palace walls became both prison and sanctuary, and beyond those walls, the world of ordinary life continued. Births, marriages, funerals, laughter, tears. Eunuchs remained witnesses on the margins, always close enough to see, never close enough to touch. And it was this distance, more than the rituals of service or the whispers of power, that most defined the quiet tragedy of their lives. For those who lived without the bonds of family, the weight of dynasty, or the comfort of children to carry their memory forward, knowledge often became the one inheritance they could cultivate and leave behind. In the silence of their chambers, and the endless hours between duties, eunuchs turned to books, scrolls and the measured strokes of the brush or pen. If the marketplace outside the palace walls reminded them of what they had lost, then the quiet world of learning offered them something they could still claim, a place where their names, though altered by their condition, could remain tethered to words and memory. This scholarly path was not one open to all, but to those who had the fortune to be placed in administrative service, or who developed a curiosity that could not be extinguished even in the confines of ritual duty. In Byzantium, eunuchs frequently served not only as courtiers and guardians, but also as record keepers. The empire's vast bureaucracy required meticulous attention to detail, and eunuchs, trusted for their lack of competing dynastic ambitions, were often set to the work of compiling imperial records, copying manuscripts, and overseeing archives. From these roles, some grew into scholars in their own right. They became the custodians of knowledge that stretched from the Roman inheritance to the Christian present, ensuring the survival of texts that might otherwise have been lost to war or decay. It was a quiet role, one seldom praised in chronicles of emperors or generals, yet indispensable to the survival of cultural memory. The knowledge they preserved outlasted the rulers they served. China provides perhaps the most vivid examples of eunuchs who walked the scholar's path. Within the Forbidden City, many eunuchs were assigned duties that placed them near the libraries and document halls of the imperial court. Some developed an expertise in calligraphy, an art highly valued in Chinese culture, and their careful strokes carried the weight of dynastic authority. The Ming dynasty in particular left behind eunuch memoirs that reveal a deep engagement with history and reflection. Liu Jin, though remembered more for his political manipulations, was part of a broader circle of eunuchs who understood the power of record-keeping. The eunuch Liu Ruoyu, in the late Ming, compiled one of the most detailed insider accounts of palace life, documenting rituals, protocols and daily practices that otherwise might have slipped into silence. His writings remain among the most important sources historians use today to reconstruct the world of the Chinese court, offering a view filtered not through emperors but through those who lived in their shadow. The Ottoman Empire, too, saw eunuchs emerge as patrons and recorders of knowledge. While many were remembered for their administrative and spiritual roles within the palace, some became collectors of manuscripts, builders of libraries, and sponsors of learning. The chief black eunuchs of Topkapi wielded immense authority, and with it came opportunities to foster scholarship. Some used their wealth and position to endow schools, commission works and support the copying of texts. In this way they left a quieter legacy, one that moved beyond the intrigues of the harem, and into the realm of intellectual continuity. The choice of scholarship was not always born from privilege alone. Often it was born from necessity. Eunuchs, unable to root themselves in family, sought permanence through words. Writing allowed them to assert a kind of selfhood that otherwise risked being erased by the demands of service. In chronicles, memoirs, and official records, they inscribed not only the lives of rulers, but traces of their own presence. Even when their names were not placed at the forefront, their work endured, silently binding them to posterity. Literature and art, too, became subtle paths of expression. In some courts, eunuchs were trained in poetry or music, arts that lent themselves to the contemplative solitude of their lives. A eunuch who had no children to sing to might still compose verses about the moon, the seasons, or the passing of time, offering to the world the music of observation rather than inheritance. In Byzantium, eunuchs occasionally entered the monastic world after their palace careers, taking with them a devotion to copying manuscripts and producing theological writings. In China, calligraphy and painting offered avenues where a eunuch's hand could shape beauty, even within the rigid confines of palace duty. What defined this scholarly path, more than anything else, was the desire to transcend silence. Eunuchs were often associated with secrecy, with the unseen, with the hidden machinery of power, but through scholarship they could speak, quietly, carefully, and enduringly. A general might conquer territory, and an emperor might raise monuments, but the eunuch who chronicled rituals or compiled records ensured that centuries later, scholars would still be reading the traces of their work. In a life that denied them lineage, this was another form of immortality, and yet there was always a duality. Knowledge was not freedom, it was another kind of service. A eunuch who recorded the emperor's words did so not for himself but for the throne. A eunuch who painted or composed often did so for the court. Their creativity was bound as their bodies had been bound, within the structures of empire. Still within those structures something human remained, the wish to create, to preserve, to mark time with more than silence. The scholar's path was not the road most eunuchs took, but for those who walked it, it became their legacy. Their lives remind us that even within systems of control and sacrifice, human beings reached for ways to define themselves beyond their role, to inscribe meaning where it might otherwise have been lost. And in their writings, their art and their records, they found a way to stand at the threshold of history, not merely as silent servants, but as quiet voices that still echo centuries later. The presence of a eunuch in the corridors of power was always more than practical, it was symbolic. They stood as living reminders of sacrifice and obedience, figures who had given up the most basic human faculties in exchange for proximity to authority. In palaces from Constantinople to Beijing, they were entrusted with the emperor's most intimate spaces, given access to the harem, the treasury, the archives, and even the ruler's private chambers. Their condition, which severed them from the possibility of dynastic ambition, was meant to make them uniquely reliable. A eunuch could not marry a princess to establish a new faction, nor could he father sons to plot dynastic claims. This absence of lineage made him appear safe. But with that safety came a shadow, for the very same features that made eunuchs indispensable also made them deeply unsettling, even threatening, in the eyes of others. In the Byzantine Empire, eunuchs were woven into both the bureaucratic and spiritual fabric of the state. Some of the most trusted officials who served emperors were eunuchs, rising to high ranks as generals, diplomats, and chamberlains. They were relied upon because they were seen as detached from the rivalries of noble houses, and yet, because they could not root themselves in traditional kinship ties, their loyalties were viewed as both absolute and fragile. Absolute, because they had no family but the emperor. Fragile, because their survival depended entirely on favor. When emperors shifted moods, when court factions turned, it was often the eunuchs who were purged, accused of whispering conspiracies, or executed as scapegoats for unrest. Their closeness to power ensured that suspicion clung to them like a shadow. China offers perhaps the most dramatic expression of this duality. From the Han Dynasty through the Ming and Qing, emperors leaned heavily on eunuchs as palace servants, secretaries, and trusted intermediaries. Their access to the inner court made them indispensable, for they carried messages, guarded imperial women, and oversaw the details of palace life. At times, emperors relied on them more than ministers or generals, precisely because they could not develop independent bases of power outside the court. Yet, the very depth of this trust inspired deep resentment among officials of the scholar gentry. Confucian moralists condemned eunuchs as corrupt, dangerous, and unnatural, warning emperors that the more they leaned on eunuch advisors, the weaker the state would become. History, especially in Chinese chronicles, often painted eunuchs as villains, symbols of decadence and decline, even while emperors depended on them completely. The Ming dynasty provides a striking example. The Emperor Yongle employed eunuchs to oversee his vast treasure fleets under the command of Zheng He, whose voyages projected Chinese power across the Indian Ocean. These eunuchs represented the emperor's will abroad, showing how far trust could extend, and yet, by the dynasty's later years, eunuchs were accused of dominating court politics, bleeding resources, and corrupting governance. When dynasties weakened, their enemies often turned blame toward eunuchs, making them the embodiment of imperial excess. To be a eunuch was therefore to live as both trusted agent and feared corrupter, never entirely free of either perception. The Ottoman court echoed these contradictions. The chief black eunuch of Topkapi Palace, known as the Kislara, wielded immense influence. He controlled access to the imperial harem, oversaw communications between the sultan and his family, and often held sway over imperial foundations and endowments. His position symbolized absolute trust. No other official could approach the private spaces of the sultan with such freedom, and yet, his power made him feared by viziers, generals, and even sultans themselves, who at times viewed the office as dangerously potent. The chief eunuch was both protector and potential manipulator, the silent figure whose proximity could either safeguard or poison the heart of empire. Trust and fear were not opposites in this world, they were intertwined. The more a eunuch was trusted, the more fear he inspired in others, and the more he himself lived in fear of sudden reversal. A life that depended entirely on favor was inherently unstable. One day's confidant could become the next day's traitor in the eyes of a suspicious ruler. To survive, eunuchs had to embody discretion, patience, and adaptability. They learned to move silently in the background, careful never to overstep yet always near enough to remain indispensable. The contradiction also had a symbolic layer. Eunuchs, by their very bodies, embodied control. They were proof of the emperor's power to reshape human life itself, to demand a sacrifice so profound that it erased the natural order of family and reproduction. To keep a eunuch close was to remind courtiers and subjects alike that the ruler held authority not just over land or armies but over the most intimate boundaries of human existence. This symbolism gave eunuchs a unique place in imperial imagination. They were seen as extensions of the ruler's will, living symbols of submission and obedience. But because they carried this symbolism, they also carried unease. Others in the palace saw in them a distortion of natural order, a reminder that power could twist life itself into strange shapes. The duality of trust and fear shaped every stage of a eunuch's life in court. They were elevated to positions of enormous influence, yet their power was always precarious, balanced on the sharp edge of suspicion. A eunuch might rise to command fleets, armies, or treasuries, but one accusation could bring his downfall. To be a eunuch was to exist permanently in the tension between indispensability and expendability. Over time, this contradiction became part of their very identity. Eunuchs learned to accept both trust and fear as inseparable. They were honored and despised, secure and vulnerable, close to the heart of empire, yet always at risk of being cast out. Theirs was a life of profound ambiguity, one where the symbols they embodied mattered as much as the tasks they performed. And in this way they became not just servants of rulers but mirrors of empire itself, trusted for their loyalty, feared for their proximity, and destined always to walk in the narrow space between. The arc of the eunuch's presence in history, stretching across continents and centuries, carried within it not only moments of profound influence, but also the seeds of decline. As empires grew old, as dynasties weakened under the weight of corruption, rebellion, or external invasion, the eunuchs who once symbolized continuity began to be recast as symbols of decay. Their trustworthiness, once celebrated, was now questioned with sharper tones. Their influence, once indispensable, was condemned as parasitic. Slowly, the structures that had sustained their presence began to collapse, until the figure of the eunuch became less a living presence of empire, and more a shadow lingering in historical memory. In Byzantium, the role of eunuchs gradually eroded with the empire itself. At their height, eunuchs had been able to rise to offices as grand as that of a general or patriarch, their celibacy seen as a form of purity that distanced them from earthly ambition. Yet by the later centuries of the Byzantine world, as military crises mounted and administrative reforms narrowed the space for ceremonial traditions, eunuchs became less visible. The empire's shrinking power allowed fewer luxuries for elaborate court life, and with the growing dominance of military aristocracy, the court's once delicate hierarchy of chamberlains and guardians lost significance. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 sealed the fate of the Byzantine eunuch, reducing him from an enduring office of imperial life to a footnote in chronicles written long after the city's towers had crumbled. China's story was longer and more complex, but it followed a similar rhythm. The eunuch institution persisted for millennia, surviving dynasty after dynasty, but it was within China that the cycle of rise and decline was most pronounced. During the Ming dynasty, eunuchs had reached their greatest prominence, controlling departments of the court, directing foreign policy, even leading voyages across oceans. But this very prominence triggered growing resentment from Confucian officials, who saw their power as both unnatural and dangerous. When the Ming collapsed in the mid-17th century, eunuchs were blamed for weakening the dynasty, accused of corrupting emperors, draining resources, and interfering in governance. The Qing dynasty initially tried to reduce their presence, limiting their authority and numbers, but habit and necessity preserved the role. Still, by the 19th century, as foreign invasions, rebellions and modernization spread across China, eunuchs appeared increasingly as relics of a past that no longer suited the age. Reformers, influenced by Western and Japanese models, saw the eunuch system as a symbol of backwardness. By the time the last emperor Puyi was forced to abdicate in 1912, eunuchs remained only as fragile servants of a fading palace, their numbers dwindling with each passing year. When the Forbidden City was finally converted into a museum, a few eunuchs still lingered among its halls, old men carrying memories of a vanished world, but their time had come to an end. The Ottoman Empire saw a similar narrowing of roles. The chief black eunuch of the harem, once one of the most powerful officials in the empire, held great sway in the 17th and 18th centuries, mediating between sultans, concubines, and viziers. But as the empire modernized in the 19th century under pressure from European powers, the very idea of eunuchs controlling access to rulers and their families came to be seen as anachronistic. Reforms known as the Tanzimat sought to streamline administration, replacing old hierarchies with bureaucracies modeled after European states. The eunuchs remained as ceremonial guardians of the harem, but their political power had already ebbed. By the early 20th century, as the empire itself neared dissolution, the institution of eunuchs seemed less a central feature of governance, and more an echo of a bygone courtly world. Beyond these major empires, the pattern repeated itself wherever eunuchs had existed. In ancient Mesopotamia, where eunuchs had first appeared in records as servants of temples and royal courts, their memory faded long before the civilizations themselves were extinguished. In medieval courts of Europe, where castrati sometimes served ecclesiastical or musical functions, reforms of the church slowly erased their presence. The march of modernity, with its emphasis on bureaucratic rationality, professional armies, and redefined notions of dignity and rights, simply had no place for men whose bodies had been reshaped to fit the needs of rulers. Decline did not arrive in a single moment. Rather, it was a slow, almost imperceptible process, the gradual stripping away of importance. A eunuch who had once carried the keys to the emperor's chambers might find his duties reduced to ceremonial appearances. A guardian of the harem might become an attendant at banquets, his presence a gesture of tradition rather than a position of real authority. In many courts, the younger generations of eunuchs entered service not with hopes of influence, but with the knowledge that they were joining an institution that no longer commanded the reverence of the past. And yet, even in their decline, eunuchs carried weighty symbolism. Reformers who abolished eunuch roles often invoked them as emblems of everything that had gone wrong with the old systems: corruption, decadence, unnatural customs. To remove eunuchs was to signal a break with the past, an embrace of a new order. But in making them symbols of decline, societies also preserved their memory in another way, writing them into the narrative of history as necessary scapegoats for the fall of empires. By the 20th century, only fragments remained. In China, the last eunuchs lived into the 1970s, their bodies frail, their voices thin, their presence almost ghost-like amid a modernizing state that no longer had any need for them. In Turkey, the remnants of the Ottoman palace system vanished with the abolition of the Sultanate, leaving eunuchs only in memoirs and old records. In the West, the legacy of castrati singers lingered as an echo in music, but never again in the service of state or church. What was once an institution spanning continents had withered into memory, its shadows stretched long but faint across the historical record. The decline of eunuchs then was not just the decline of a role but the decline of a worldview. They had thrived in societies where personal access to rulers mattered more than abstract institutions, where loyalty was measured by closeness rather than law, and where symbols of sacrifice reinforced power. As empires shifted toward modern forms of governance, these conditions dissolved. Bureaucracy, constitutions, and new technologies rendered obsolete the figure of the eunuch who stood guard outside the emperor's door. Their disappearance signaled not only the fall of dynasties, but also the fading of an older world in which human bodies themselves had been reshaped to sustain the machinery of power. The Ottoman Empire saw a similar narrowing of roles. The chief black eunuch of the harem, once one of the most powerful officials in the empire, held great sway in the 17th and 18th centuries, mediating between sultans, concubines, and viziers. But as the empire modernized in the 19th century under pressure from European powers, the very idea of eunuchs controlling access to rulers and their families came to be seen as anachronistic. Reforms known as the Tanzimat sought to streamline administration, replacing old hierarchies with bureaucracies modeled after European states. The eunuchs remained as ceremonial guardians of the harem, but their political power had already ebbed. By the early 20th century, as the empire itself neared dissolution, the institution of eunuchs seemed less a central feature of governance, and more an echo of a bygone courtly world. Beyond these major empires, the pattern repeated itself wherever eunuchs had existed. In ancient Mesopotamia, where eunuchs had first appeared in records as servants of temples and royal courts, their memory faded long before the civilizations themselves were extinguished. In medieval courts of Europe, where castrati sometimes served ecclesiastical or musical functions, reforms of the church slowly erased their presence. The march of modernity, with its emphasis on bureaucratic rationality, professional armies, and redefined notions of dignity and rights, simply had no place for men whose bodies had been reshaped to fit the needs of rulers. Decline did not arrive in a single moment. Rather, it was a slow, almost imperceptible process, the gradual stripping away of importance. A eunuch who had once carried the keys to the emperor's chambers might find his duties reduced to ceremonial appearances. A guardian of the harem might become an attendant at banquets, his presence a gesture of tradition rather than a position of real authority. In many courts, the younger generations of eunuchs entered service not with hopes of influence, but with the knowledge that they were joining an institution that no longer commanded the reverence of the past. And yet, even in their decline, eunuchs carried weighty symbolism. Reformers who abolished eunuch roles often invoked them as emblems of everything that had gone wrong with the old systems: corruption, decadence, unnatural customs. To remove eunuchs was to signal a break with the past, an embrace of a new order. But in making them symbols of decline, societies also preserved their memory in another way, writing them into the narrative of history as necessary scapegoats for the fall of empires. By the 20th century, only fragments remained. In China, the last eunuchs lived into the 1970s, their bodies frail, their voices thin, their presence almost ghost-like amid a modernizing state that no longer had any need for them. In Turkey, the remnants of the Ottoman palace system vanished with the abolition of the Sultanate, leaving eunuchs only in memoirs and old records. In the West, the legacy of castrati singers lingered as an echo in music, but never again in the service of state or church. What was once an institution spanning continents had withered into memory. Its shadows stretched long but faint across the historical record. The decline of eunuchs then was not just the decline of a role but the decline of a worldview. They had thrived in societies where personal access to rulers mattered more than abstract institutions, where loyalty was measured by closeness rather than law, and where symbols of sacrifice reinforced power. As empires shifted toward modern forms of governance, these conditions dissolved. Bureaucracy, constitutions, and new technologies rendered obsolete the figure of the eunuch who stood guard outside the emperor's door. Their disappearance signaled not only the fall of dynasties, but also the fading of an older world in which human bodies themselves had been reshaped to sustain the machinery of power. And so, the eunuch passed into history not with dramatic upheaval, but with a quiet fading, their roles hollowed out by reform, their bodies surviving as reminders of sacrifices once demanded, their stories preserved only in chronicles, memoirs, and the stones of palaces that now serve as museums. The trust they once commanded, the fear they once inspired, and the contradictions they embodied slowly dissolved into silence. The twilight of a eunuch's life was often as quiet and subdued as his years of service had been, but in those last stages, the silence deepened into something more haunting. For the world outside the palace gates had shifted so dramatically that the rituals of his life no longer carried their former meaning. Where once his footsteps on polished stones had been part of the rhythm of empire, they now fell on floors that echoed with emptiness, corridors that had lost their emperors, sultans, or kings. Still, many remained in service until the end, their identities so bound to the palace that even as regimes collapsed and reforms swept the old systems away, they could not imagine leaving. Service was no longer simply duty, it had become the very substance of life, a final tether between the body and the fading memory of power. In the Forbidden City, when the Qing dynasty gave way to the Republic of China in 1912, the eunuchs who had once guarded its gates and swept its halls were allowed to remain at least for a time. The abdicated Emperor Puyi was permitted to continue living in a section of the palace under a special agreement, and with him stayed a dwindling retinue of eunuchs, men who had served under emperors and empresses in an imperial world that no longer existed. They polished floors, prepared meals, and kept the rituals of the court alive, even when those rituals were little more than empty gestures in a palace now surrounded by the turbulence of revolution and war. For them there was no retirement, no home to which they might return, no family awaiting them beyond the palace walls. The palace was their world, and service their final act. These last years were marked by a strange contrast. On one hand, eunuchs carried out their duties with the same meticulous care as they had in the height of empire. They maintained the imperial gardens, opened and closed the carved wooden doors, and ensured that ceremonies, however reduced, carried on with the dignity of old. On the other hand, they lived in an age where visitors and even reformers regarded them as curiosities, relics of a system that the modern world sought to forget. For younger officials, their presence was a reminder of the corruption and decadence blamed for the fall of dynasties. For ordinary people, they were shadows of a bygone court life, strange men who had given their bodies to an order that no longer had any claim on the nation. Yet for the eunuchs themselves, service continued as though nothing had changed, their identities so woven into the fabric of palace life, that even as the palace itself became something else, they continued their silent duties. The Ottoman story held its own version of this final service. In the last decades of the empire, as the harem was emptied, and the sultanate lost its hold on power, eunuchs remained as ceremonial guardians, moving quietly through halls now echoing with fewer voices. The chief black eunuch, once a political force who negotiated with viziers, and even controlled imperial succession, had by then become a figure of diminished relevance, a custodian of rituals that had already lost their meaning. When the sultanate was finally abolished in the early 20th century, the eunuchs of the harem faded into obscurity. Some were pensioned off, others lingered near palaces converted into museums or government offices. Their last years were defined less by grandeur and more by routine, ensuring rooms were dusted, gardens were trimmed, and memories of empire lingered just a little longer through their hands. For each eunuch, the end of service also meant confronting his own solitude in its sharpest form. Unlike other servants or officials who might retire to families or estates, eunuchs had no children to inherit their belongings, no households to retreat into. Their bodies, altered long ago, had ensured a lifetime of detachment from the rhythms of family life. Thus, their final service was not only to the palace but also to themselves, a way of preserving identity in the face of an absence that would otherwise consume them. To stop serving would mean dissolving into nothingness, while to continue even when emperors were gone meant retaining at least a fragment of the self. The image of an old eunuch sweeping empty halls is one that lingers in memoirs and chronicles. Visitors to the Forbidden City in the early Republican years sometimes described seeing elderly eunuchs moving slowly through the courtyards, their voices thin, their bodies stooped, their eyes still lowered as if before an unseen emperor. In their frailty, they embodied both loyalty and tragedy. Loyalty to traditions that no longer bound the world, and tragedy in the sense that their lives had been so completely given to an order that vanished before they did. For them, the end of empire did not mean the end of duty, it meant only that duty had become untethered from purpose, persisting purely as routine until the final breath. Some eunuchs left behind testimonies of their lives, often recorded in interviews or memoirs. These reflections capture the sense of quiet endurance in their final years. They spoke of watching rulers come and go, of tending to rituals repeated so often that they became second nature, and of the loneliness that deepened as comrades passed away, and the halls grew emptier. In their recollections, the palace itself almost became a companion, a structure that had absorbed their lives so completely that leaving it was unthinkable. And so, in their last years, they remained, serving the palace even when the palace no longer needed them. The final service of a eunuch was therefore not just a continuation of tasks but also an affirmation of identity. To stand in the doorway of a chamber, to carry a tray of tea, to light the lamps in the evening, these were more than duties. They were the last rituals through which the eunuch affirmed his existence, the last way to resist the dissolution of memory into silence. His body had long ago been transformed, his life long ago confined, but in serving until the end, he claimed a measure of dignity within the only world he had ever known. And so, as the 20th century advanced, the image of the eunuch faded from living reality into memory. The last among them died quietly, often buried without ceremony, their belongings scattered, their names forgotten outside of official lists and occasional memoirs. Yet in their final service, they carried with them the weight of centuries, embodying in their fragile frames the persistence of an institution that had shaped empires. Death, when it finally came for a eunuch, was quiet, almost anticlimactic, and yet deeply symbolic of the life he had led. For men whose very existence had been shaped by absence, the absence of family, of children, of inheritance, the end of life often carried that absence to its final conclusion. The eunuch's body, already altered long ago in ways that set him apart from the natural rhythms of manhood, now became a vessel without heirs, a life that ended without continuation. And so it was that their burials, far from grand or familial, often mirrored the silence of their lives, fading into history with little more than a trace. In many cultures, lineage and family graves carried deep significance, for they anchored a person in time and space. A man might expect to be buried among his ancestors, beside his parents, or in a family plot that would later hold his children. But the eunuch was a man without descendants, without the bonds of blood that tied most to generations past and future. His burial therefore became a practical matter rather than a familial one, often arranged by the palace, by fellow eunuchs, or by the institutions they served. While some high-ranking eunuchs, particularly in China or Byzantium, accumulated wealth and were able to construct tombs for themselves, most were interred with little ceremony, their graves unmarked or poorly remembered. The Forbidden City offers some of the most striking images of this final anonymity. Records show that eunuchs often lived and died within its walls, their remains carried out quietly after death. Some were buried in small cemeteries reserved for eunuchs, tucked into corners of Beijing where their names were inscribed modestly, if at all. A few who served faithfully under favored emperors were granted burial in larger complexes, but even then, their tombstones carried none of the elaborate inscriptions reserved for officials, generals, or scholars. Their stones were plain, their names reduced to titles or simple references that gave no sense of the lives they had lived behind palace walls. With time, these markers were weathered away, and the men themselves faded from memory. In the Byzantine world, eunuchs sometimes reached great heights of influence, serving as generals, admirals, or patriarchs within the church. Yet even for these figures, death held a strange duality. Some were entombed in imperial monasteries, remembered by their contemporaries as powerful and loyal servants of the empire, but many more, especially the countless eunuchs who filled the lower ranks of court service, were buried without fanfare, their remains resting in simple graves within monastic grounds. The chroniclers, who so often described the deeds of emperors and nobles, rarely spared more than a line for the passing of a eunuch, even one who had spent decades at the side of rulers. The silence of burial thus reflected the silence of history. The Ottoman Empire tells a similar story. Black eunuchs of the imperial harem, who had once stood at the heart of power as guardians of the sultan's women and keepers of palace secrets, often ended their lives in quiet quarters, their bodies buried in cemeteries attached to mosques. Some were laid to rest near the palace, close to the world they had served so faithfully, while others were buried in cemeteries reserved for slaves and servants. A few chief eunuchs who had amassed wealth and influence constructed modest mausoleums for themselves, but these were exceptions rather than the rule. For most, their burials were indistinguishable from those of countless unnamed servants who had lived and died in obscurity. The tragedy of the eunuch's burial lay not only in its modesty, but also in its detachment from lineage. Graves without descendants are graves without memory, for it is children and grandchildren who tend the stones, sweep away the dust, and ensure that names remain spoken. Eunuchs, lacking this chain of memory, often slipped into obscurity within a generation. Their graves fell into disrepair, their names lost from family records, their identities surviving only in scattered chronicles or inscriptions when fortune allowed. In this way, their lives mirrored their deaths, significant in service, invisible in memory. This anonymity also held symbolic weight, for in many societies, burial was not merely a matter of disposing of the body, but of affirming a person's place within the social order, of linking them to both the living and the dead. The eunuch's burial, often modest and detached, reinforced his position as an outsider, someone who had lived within society, but apart from its natural bonds. His service had been close to power, yet his final rest was at the margins, on the edges of cemeteries, in plots that few would visit. Even when buried among others of his kind, the lack of descendants meant that over time, even these collective cemeteries fell into neglect, their stones forgotten, their names erased by time. The fate of eunuchs in their burials also speaks to the broader fading of the institution itself. By the 20th century, when the last eunuchs of the Qing dynasty died in Beijing, their burials marked the closing of an age. Visitors recorded their passing with a sense of curiosity, noting that these were among the last living remnants of a vanished order. Their graves, modest and often unmarked, became symbols of an institution that had once been vast and powerful, yet ended in quiet obscurity. The body that had been altered in youth, that had served faithfully through decades of palace life, finally rested in the earth, its story unremembered, except in faint traces left for historians to rediscover. Thus, the burial of eunuchs serves as both an ending and an erasure. They entered history in silence, lived in service, and left the world with little more than a whisper. Their final service was to disappear into the ground without burdening others, their names carried away by time, their graves blending into the anonymity of forgotten cemeteries. For the eunuch, death did not bring the recognition of a life lived, but rather the confirmation of a life surrendered, one that passed quietly into the soil, leaving behind only shadows in chronicles and faint echoes in memory. In the quiet stillness of history, after the palaces have fallen silent and the courts have long since dissolved, the presence of eunuchs lingers only as an echo. They are not remembered in the same way as kings or generals, nor celebrated as poets or saints, yet they remain threaded through centuries of human civilization, a shadow that appears and disappears across cultures, always at the edge of power, always shaping events while standing apart from them. To reflect on the eunuch's life is to contemplate a paradox, a life marked by absence, yet full of influence, a body reshaped against nature, yet woven into the fabric of empires, a figure both trusted and feared, revered and despised, indispensable and disposable. Their legacy rests in this contradiction, a mirror reflecting the complexities of power and the costs of service. The eunuch's existence raises questions about what societies demanded in order to maintain control. That rulers across civilizations from China to Byzantium, from the Ottoman Empire to Mughal India, all turned to eunuchs suggests a universal recognition of their utility. Castration, as brutal and dehumanizing as it was, produced servants who stood outside the web of family ties and dynastic ambitions. It made them uniquely suited to be guardians of women's quarters, keepers of secrets, managers of households, and advisors whose loyalty, at least in theory, could not be divided. They were shaped into tools of stability, men who became more than men, and yet less than men, crafted into living instruments of the state. The echo of their lives, then, is a reminder of how power often demands sacrifices that reach the very body itself. Yet their legacy is not only institutional, it is also profoundly human. For eunuchs embodied the tension between identity and service, between self and role. Stripped of the possibility of biological lineage, they crafted identities through duty, loyalty, and influence. Some rose to remarkable heights, shaping dynasties and altering the course of empires, yet even the most powerful remained marked by the absence that defined them. Others sank into obscurity, their lives reduced to menial tasks, their names unrecorded, their bodies buried in silence. Together they represent the wide spectrum of human response to loss. Some sought meaning in ambition, others in learning, others in quiet resignation. Their stories are as diverse as the societies that created them, and yet all share the common thread of transformation. A childhood altered, a body reshaped, a destiny diverted toward a life not chosen but imposed. The fascination with eunuchs in modern times reflects this tension. Historians, novelists, and filmmakers return again and again to their stories, drawn by the contradictions they embody. Eunuchs represent both victimhood and power, silence and influence, tragedy and resilience. They unsettle the categories through which we often understand history, for they cannot be easily placed among soldiers, priests, or rulers. Instead, they stand between worlds, between the palace and the prison, between trust and suspicion, between honor and humiliation. This in-betweenness makes them enduring figures in human imagination, symbols of the strange bargain societies strike in the pursuit of order and control. There is also a moral dimension to their echo. To consider the life of a eunuch is to confront the human cost of empire, the sacrifices demanded by rulers who place stability above individual dignity. Castration was not merely a physical act, but a stripping of autonomy, a reshaping of destiny, often imposed on the young and powerless. And yet, from this act of violence emerged individuals who learned to navigate the narrow corridors of their lives with remarkable adaptability. Some became indispensable advisors, some custodians of knowledge, some chroniclers of the very empires that had remade them. Their resilience is part of their legacy, a reminder of the human capacity to create meaning even from loss. And then there is the silence, the great silence that surrounds them. For every eunuch remembered in chronicles or inscriptions, countless others lived and died in anonymity, their stories unrecorded, their graves forgotten. This silence is part of their echo too, for it reminds us that history is not only about the powerful, but also about those who served power in ways unseen. To reflect on eunuchs is to look into the margins of history, into the lives that supported empires from the shadows, into the voices that rarely spoke, but whose presence shaped the rhythms of daily life at court. Their legacy, then, is as much about absence as it is about presence, as much about what is forgotten as what is remembered. In the end, the eunuch's life remains one of history's haunting enigmas. It is a story of transformation, of service, of loneliness, of influence, of silence, and of resilience. They remind us that power is never simple, that loyalty is never without cost, and that history is filled with lives that do not fit easily into categories of glory or shame. The eunuch lived at the threshold, not fully part of family, not fully outside society, not fully powerless, not fully powerful, and in this threshold existence lies their enduring fascination. As the centuries pass, their names fade, their graves crumble, and their institutions vanish, but the echo remains. It lingers in the pages of chronicles, in the ruins of palaces, in the whispered fascination of modern retellings. The eunuch's life reveals the strange bargains of empire, the depths of human adaptation, and the silence that surrounds those who served in ways both essential and invisible. It is an echo that will never fully disappear, because it speaks not only of eunuchs but of the larger human condition, of sacrifice, of resilience, and of the quiet costs of history itself.